My name is Gentagara. I served as ambassador of the Jadani to the United Galactic Council for 85 galactic standard years, an impressive feat considering the average Jadani only lives to 110. In that time, I experienced the Council's first contact with over a dozen different species: the Hadar, Karil, Mensoril, Fintaran, so many others. However, the most notable by far was, obviously, humanity. First contact with them was interesting, yet at the same time, mundane. A Kenar freighter had become critically damaged due to a pirate attack. Despite the risk, the captain ordered an FTL course to the nearest known inhabited system. Due to the damage, their drive eventually failed. They dropped out of warp and were left drifting just within the orbit of the dwarf planet we'd later come to find out was called Pluto. While they tried to repair their drive, their remaining operational sensors alerted them to the approach of 7 unknown vessels. Being completely defenseless and not knowing which species the ships belonged to, they broadcasted a message of unconditional surrender in the language of binary. It had become the most basic form of communication, since so far, it seemed to be universal, though once first contact was over. The use of Galactic Basic was heavily encouraged, though not required. It was believed even the most violent species would accept an unconditional surrender, since a ship not destroyed was a ship worth salvage, loot, and possibly ransom for its crew. Plus, you could always blow it up later after taking everything of value. To their surprise, the ships stopped almost immediately. They sat unmoving for what seemed like an eternity, their sublight engines idling and their primary weapon system readied but untargeted. 2 of the ships were different in that they had no detectable weapons of any kind. The Kenar were then even more surprised when their sensors told them the unknown ships were powering down their weapons and their communications. Ere received a return message in binary. It read,
"Your ship seems crippled. Do you require assistance?"
That was the first interaction between the UGC and humanity. The 2 ships without weapons were a ship dedicated solely to repairing other ships and what the humans call a hospital ship, or a vessel whose primary purpose was to render longer-term medical aid than what might be capable in a ship's sick bay, and thus carried no weapons as a sign of its non-combatant status. After the freighter was repaired, the Kenar and humans exchanged the things typical of species who experience peaceful first contact. Information about each other, what they knew of the wider galaxy, more sophisticated ways of communicating, cultural exchanges. Overall, it was a pleasant, if unremarkable, first contact. Soon, human dignitaries met with the wider council. They seemed like most other peaceable species, amicable, eager to learn about the species of the council, open to diplomacy. Their initial approach to the Kenar vessel with weapons ready was understandable, and wasn't taken as a sign they would be one of the more warlike species, like the Ned-tier, Akar, or Iarkan. They were encountering an unknown alien people for the first time, and had to be ready for anything. In fact, they were lauded for not only sending warships to investigate the unknown intruders, but also aid vessels, despite not knowing the intentions of the ship. After much discussion, debate, and negotiation, they were offered and accepted membership in the Council. And for a while it seemed like nothing had really changed in the galaxy. The human system quickly became a center of commerce and industry. They had a knack for making friends, trading, and building. They were always willing to make compromises, and it served them well. They also had an explorative spirit that caused them to expand rapidly. They were lucky in that virtually all of the systems in what they called the local bubble, a region roughly 300 light-years in diameter, centered around their system's star, were not claimed by any other species, and so they were able to rapidly expand, and before long, they had claimed the region for themselves. Their direct control was felt on over 300 planets and tens of thousands of asteroids, albeit the vast majority of them were simple mining, trade, and supply outposts, with a smaller amount of military outposts to protect them. Pretty much all of their more hostile encounters led to them making concessions with their enemies. Once, a small species called the Theans, located on the edge of human space, invaded the nearest human system that they claimed they had a centuries-old claim on, destroyed the military outposts protecting the civilian ones, and basically dared them to take them back. Surprisingly, the humans refused the provocation, and through the UGC had a peace arbitrated. In return for the return of the system, the humans not only forgave them for their hostile actions, but even granted them limited rights to the resources from the system, as well as decently sized financial aid. Another time, a group of Kirill terrorists took a human city on the planet of Ava hostage, threatening to level the city with a stolen nuclear warhead. In return for not glassing the city, the terrorists wanted the release of another Kirill terrorist cell that had been captured by the Milia, a species that had had little interaction with humanity, and what little they had been less than pleasant. To many, the humans seemed to be in a tricky spot. They had 50 million people with a nuclear gun to their heads, and their only two options seemed to be to try and free them with direct military action that might result in nuclear annihilation, or try and negotiate the release of terrorists from a species they hadn't had much cordial interaction with, which would set a dangerous precedent. To most people's surprise, the humans poured all of their charisma and negotiating skills into convincing the Milia to give them the people the terrorists wanted released. They managed it, but at a heavy cost. Over 5 trillion galactic monetary units worth of resources, discounts, and direct financial aid. In the end, they were able to satisfy the terrorists and regain control of the city. It was not a complete disaster. The humans were able to track most of the terrorists' ships as they left the system, and with the aid of the Kirill, Milia, and a couple of the other species, most of the terrorists were recaptured or killed. But the thing most species took note of from these incidents was the lengths humanity would go to avoid using their military in seemingly even the most desperate of situations. Which brings me to a topic many at the time didn't think of when discussing humans: their military. They had, of course, undergone various exchanges of military-related technology and such, but it had never seemed like their strong suit. They were as competent at fighting as most were, and their equipment was even considered largely inferior due to the fact that their weapons were mostly still ballistics-based, using chemical propellants to accelerate bits of metal to a high velocity. The main exception was their warships, which used a combination of railguns and missiles. Overall, the few that took a major interest in humanity's war-fighting ability largely concluded that had one of the major warlike species, like the Icar I mentioned before, decided they wanted to make humanity subservient to them. Like they had several species already, the humans would put up a decent fight but be overrun relatively quickly. It was deemed they just didn't have the capacity, spirit, or will to fight a large, prolonged, multi-system war. Gods, I wish they had never needed to be proven wrong. The shattering of the galactic-wide illusion that humanity were pushovers ended a mere 5 years after the terrorist incident on Ava. The humans shared a border with the Hadzai, the largest of the warlike species in the UGC. They were bipedal mammals, like the humans. 2 arms, 2 legs, average height of about 6 Earth feet, average weight of 200 Earth pounds. Though they did have much thicker hair on their arms and legs than humans due to their planet being slightly colder on average than Earth. Human relations with them had been both hot and cold. Initially, the Hadzai didn't much care about humanity one way or another. As they became the mercantile powerhouse they were largely known as at the time, relations warmed up as human goods started entering the HFY economy. But once human control had expanded to their borders, they became increasingly hostile to humanity. The HFY had grown used to controlling the largest amount of territory of any UGC species, but it seemed they were growing worried about no longer being, as the humans would say, the biggest fish in the pond. Humanity tried its usual tactics of generous offers and concessions, but no matter how much they gave up or gifted, the HFY always wanted more. The final straw came when the HFY military crossed the border and took an entire cluster known by the humans as Hyades. Hyades contained over a third of humanity's habitable worlds and produced the majority of their thallium, gallium, and yttrium. When their own charisma failed, they turned to the Council for arbitration. Over the years, I had grown fond of the humans, as many of my people had, and made the point to become good friends with every human ambassador that had come along. During this crisis, the human ambassador was a female named Alexandra Hansen. She was the youngest human ambassador so far, having been assigned a position at 30 human years old, though she was now 35. I must admit I did find myself fancying her more than I did most human females. Something about her I found very attractive, something aside from her physical appearance which was already very easy on the eyes. We're still not quite sure why, but Jadani and humans can intermate with each other. So while it wasn't common, some Jadani and humans entered relationships and had children. Probably helped that we look almost identical to humans, aside from our skin coming in many more colors. For example, my skin is a light red. I'm told humans call it coral red. Anyhow, I also must confess that I had considered possibly trying to take my friendship with Alexandra, or Allie to her friends, further, but after much consideration. I decided that since it would basically force us out of our jobs for obvious reasons, it was best to leave things at a very friendly, though professional level. Not to mention I was twice her age, which, while not an uncommon thing for Jadani, was a generally frowned-upon thing by humans. Anyway, when Allie had come to me while preparations for the arbitration were underway, I was curious. She knew that I was part of the committee that dealt with arbitrations, and as such, coming to me mere hours before the first meeting was to occur would look very much like she was trying to influence me. It was when I saw the look on her face that I knew why she had come. She was scared.
Thanks for meeting with me, Ambassador Gara.
I chuckled. She was always so formal.
Please, Allie, you know you can just call me Genta.
I was glad to see her smile, even if only for a moment.
I know, just the force of habit, I guess. You know I always stay formal when I'm meeting others as the human ambassador, so I get used to it. Anyways, I guess you know why I'm here.
Yes, I imagined you might want to talk about the arbitration, though I am curious why you would take the risk of being seen as trying to influence my decision by coming to me in the council building.
Allie sighed as she sat down and reached for the bottle of alcohol I kept around just for her visits. It was a bottle of something the humans called Jack Daniels. She poured herself an ounce or so before gulping it down and pouring a full drink.
It is about the arbitration, but definitely not to influence you. In fact, I'm really not even here as the human ambassador. I'm just here as a human who is scared for what the future might hold.
I honestly couldn't tell if she was trying some kind of strange psychological tactic for some reason. In our time as friends, I had never seen her worried about anything. Even during the time of the Ava crisis, when she had only been the ambassador for a few months, she showed both the public and me nothing but cool and calm. Then again, I also suppose I could see how this crisis far dwarfed that of one that concerned only a single city. I thought that perhaps those that believed humanity was weak were right, and she was worried that if things didn't go humanity's way, this would be the start of their subjugation. I carefully thought my words over before speaking.
Ali, if you're worried that the Hadzai might prevail in the arbitration and use it as a stepping stone to a full annexation, I believe I can assure you that the Jadani—
She cut me off with a shake of her head.
No, my friend, it's not that I'm worried about. No, I'm here because I'm worried that the Hadzai won't see reason and at least work with us for a more amicable solution to this problem, that they'll force our hand.
I was now thoroughly puzzled.
What do you mean by force your hand?
Allie chuckled before taking another sip of her drink.
Genta, I and the rest of my race are well aware of the rest of the galaxy's view on humanity, that we're weak and can't defend ourselves. I obviously can't go into details, but between us, I can assure you that's far from the truth. We don't avoid war because we can't wage it. We avoid war because war is nothing but suffering and misery incarnate. It never brings anything good. I believe you are familiar with the Christian concept of hell.
It took me a moment, but I remembered when I learned about the religion humans call Christianity.
Yes. Hell is believed to be the place or state into which, by God's definitive judgment, unrepentant sinners pass in judgment. It has been described as a place of perpetual conscious torment, both physical and spiritual, with much emphasis placed on fire, burning, and unquenchable thirst.
She nodded.
That is the majority opinion nowadays, though as with any religion there are many different beliefs. Anyway, my people have a saying. It originates from a time when humanity was just starting to experience what industrialized war was like, where death came quick, without warning, and en masse.
She finished the rest of her drink in one gulp.
War is hell.
She poured herself yet another drink, which caused me to start to get worried. She had to take part in the arbitration soon, but this was her third drink in just 10 minutes, and she obviously knew being drunk was not a good state to be in when dealing with sensitive issues.
Personally, I cannot disagree. While I have not obviously experienced war firsthand, for my training while I was in the military, I was subjected to virtual recreations, with audio, visuals, and physical sensations of the wars from before my people took to the stars to prepare my mind for what war would be like.
Her face became dark for a moment, before returning to its so far almost constant look of depression.
I won't discuss them, but needless to say, they dwarf just about anything any other race has seen from what I've read.
My thoughts drifted back to my learning of my own people's wars, both internal and after we'd taken to space. The Jadani had quickly learned that there was more to be gained by cooperation than by force. Our worst was our one worldwide war, and the hundreds of thousands killed convinced us there had to be a better way. Thankfully, we have still been able to defend ourselves, having done so on several occasions, and no other species had yet to deem us worth the trouble of fully conquering. The worst war I could think of was by far the Nedtir-Fintaran War. Having lasted 4 years, it had cost around 200 million dead and crippled both species for years. I collected my thoughts and returned to the conversation.
So why is it you're here, Ali? Are you simply looking for assurances all will be fine?
She shook her head.
Not really, though they'd be nice. I'm here to ask, not as the human ambassador, but as just a normal human, that you and the arbitration committee do everything you can to get the Hadzai to work with us. As you can imagine, they can't have the entire cluster, but you also know that we're more than open to almost anything below that.
I gave her my best reassuring smile.
I assure you, Ali, that we'll get things set right.
Allie smiled again, though this one was much more somber than her last one.
I hope so, Genta. I hope with every fiber of my being that the thing my people fear the most does not come to pass.
My interest was piqued.
If I may ask, what is this thing your people fear the most?
She looked to her right, out a window at the lush gardens below that held plants from every UGC world, before looking back to me, the look on her face somehow more somber and dark than it ever had.
When good men go to war.
The first arbitration meeting began, and I could tell, almost from those first minutes, that things weren't going to go well. The HFY had always been hard-headed, but they seemed unwilling to make even the smallest concessions. The view that humanity was weak had seemingly been hardwired into the HFY ambassador's brain. At first, we tried getting him to see that war wouldn't serve them any purpose, but the ambassador countered by claiming that it obviously would, with the resources of an entire star cluster being more than worth a little trouble. Then we tried explaining that a full-out war between species would be more than a little trouble, citing the Nedtir-Fintaran War. He retorted that humanity would never be able to put up as much of a fight as either of those species had. In this regard, humanity's so far peaceful and concession-laden path gave us little we could argue with. An overall view of species militaries was generally information that was public knowledge, and with what was publicly available, the humans did definitely seem to be the weaker of the two species. Their navy was only a third the size of the HFY's, with their groundside forces being half. They controlled roughly the same amount of planets and outposts, but whereas the HFY had a military outpost for every civilian one, humanity only had about one military for every 4 civilian. With that in mind, I suppose I can't blame people at the time for thinking they were weak. Gods. I wish the humans had been more open with their history back then. Maybe we could have been more persuasive. Anyway, we then tried to get him to budge with promises of resources and financial aid from several other species, including the Jadani, that when coupled with some human concessions, would result in them getting a majority of the value they'd get from controlling the star cluster. Again, he reiterated that they wouldn't need to settle for less value than they'd get from the cluster, since they'd easily be able to defeat the humans should they refuse to relinquish claim over the cluster. After nearly an entire day of talks, a recess till the next day was called, and I returned to my office after some discussions with the other committee members. To my surprise and slight discomfort, I found the HFY ambassador, a male called Hayden Iyer, sitting on the chair in front of my desk, facing away from the door. He was sipping on a drink. Probably that disgusting Maladon swill that was supposedly wine.
Ambassador Gara, I was hoping to catch you before you prepared to leave.
I sat down at my desk and did my best to be courteous and professional, even though after an entire day of chest-thumping, grandiose claims, and stubbornness, I was not in the mood for him.
Ambassador Iyer, you know you should not be here. It might give the impression—
He laughed, which merely irritated me more.
Mr. Gara, I'm not here to influence you. These arbitration meetings are pointless. We are not giving up the star cluster. We have no need to. The only thing that could tempt us is a larger prize. A prize which we know the humans do not have, and that the rest of the UGC will not be willing to give up. Even if the humans did try and resist, our superior military forces would defeat theirs within a few months. In that case, we would win an even greater prize than the one they tried to deny us.
He took another sip from his drink.
Their entire dominion,
Empire.
Said a voice from behind him. Hayden turned in his seat, and I leaned over to see around him. I always did hate that my office had a chair directly between me and the door, leaving me unable to see past it when someone sat it in. From the voice, though, I knew it was Ali.
I'm sorry, Ms. Hansen. I wasn't aware that the humans considered themselves rulers of an empire.
Hayden said through a smirk. Ali walked forward slightly.
First, it's Ambassador Hansen. Second, if you didn't know we were an empire, then you're a terrible ambassador. It's in our name, the United Earth Empire. Though we haven't been a true empire since long before First Contact, we've kept the name because, honestly, it just sounds cool.
I stood up from my seat and moved to stand between them, but at a respectable distance away.
Ambassador Hansen,
I started.
to what do I owe the pleasure?
Ali glanced at me, but returned her glare to Hayden before replying.
Ambassador Guerra, I'm glad you're here. Maybe you can help me to privately convince Ambassador R to finally see sense.
Haydn angrily sighed and didn't even look at her while he spoke.
I guess you weren't listening during that entire pointless meeting, and I don't know how much you heard of our conversation, but let me reiterate. The HFY will not give up what they have taken. If humanity wants Star Cluster 76 GF back, they will have to fight us for it. A fight they can't win.
For the first time since I'd known her, I saw Allie's face turn to a look of annoyance. Not the kind of annoyance you get while trying to solve a difficult problem, but the kind of annoyance one would show when they were tired of someone's actions. She took another 2 steps toward Haydn, who actually lifted an eyebrow and tersely said,
This might be your last chance. Agree to actually take the arbitration seriously and work with us, or our hand will be forced and you and your entire people will not like the outcome.
Haydn took in what she had said for a moment before laughing. Yes, he actually laughed in Ali's face.
Your hand will be forced? Please. Your people have shown nothing but cowardice since they showed up on the...
He was cut off by Ali, taking the remaining 3 steps to his chair rapidly and clamping her hands down violently on the chair's armrests, leaning her face to within just a few inches of Haydn's. Her face had snapped from annoyed to visibly angered within an instant. I was taken aback. I had never seen a human angry and had almost come to believe humans, especially Ali, couldn't even physically get angry, despite how silly the notion was. But I also sensed something that completely contrasted to the anger I was seeing. Desperation.
You people are toying with something you do not understand. You think we are weak. Why? Because we do not use force at the smallest inconvenience. Because we do not resort to our baser instincts at the slightest provocation. No. Where you see weakness, we see strength. Where you see timidity, we see composure. You really think that we've only shown cowardice? If you do, you are truly simple-minded. Cowardice? No, we've shown nothing but restraint and discipline. We have suppressed our baser instincts for the good of all mankind and all our friends in the galaxy. But if you keep on your current path, then we will have no choice but to cast off our inhibitions, to embrace the cold, calculated, unrelenting, anguished rage that sleeps deep within every human being's very soul. I urge you, Ambassador ER, turn back now. Alter the HFY's course before it drives them into complete and utter annihilation.
Both me and Haydn were frozen in place. I never imagined any human could ever have put on the display I just witnessed, and I could tell Haydn was thinking the same. The room stayed silent for a while until Haydn seemingly managed to work up something resembling confidence. He stood and Ali backed off but kept her face within inches of his. Well, as close as she could, with him being about a head taller than her.
Ambassador Hansen, that was quite the display. It saddens me that you would resort to such things in order to try and intimidate me into making a decision that goes against what's best for my people. I have other business to attend to, so I will take my leave. Do, please try and calm yourself for tomorrow's meeting.
With that, he walked around Ali, who turned in place and watched him as he walked out of my office. Once the door was closed, Ali appeared to have released a breath she didn't know she was holding. She backed up and sat down in the chair, putting her head in her hands. I was unsure of how to proceed, and as I tried to decide, Ali reached for the bottle of Jack Daniels beside the chair, and to my surprise, simply removed the cap and took 2 big gulps straight from the bottle before setting it down and taking in a deep breath before shakily exhaling it.
There's no stopping it now,
she said. I walked over to her and knelt so my head would be level with hers.
Stopping what?
I asked. She turned to look at me, and I was again taken aback as I saw her eyes were full of tears.
Armageddon.
The next day is one that has forever been etched into the fabric of galactic history. It was supposed to be the second day of arbitrations. Everyone I've ever known that was alive that day, human or otherwise, wishes that's all it had been. Once everyone had filed into the council chambers, the meeting began. Almost immediately, Ali stood up and walked to the speaking circle that lay before the committee's elevated podium. She was looking like her old self, but something was off. She was different somehow. I couldn't quite tell how.
Good morning, everybody.
She started.
I know that today's schedule has fully been set aside for the expected negotiations. Sadly, I do not believe that will be necessary. I have brought with me my people's most recent and by far most generous offer. However, it is also our final one. This is the ultimatum, the last chance to avoid a full-blown calamity.
That got the committee's attention, as well as the rest of the chambers. See, while these arbitrations were handled by a select committee, it had also been written that the entire council needed to be convened for them to occur. It had been so that the committee couldn't become some secret arbiter of favors. All meetings of the council were also broadcast live via the council-sanctioned Galactic News Network for the sake of transparency and another barrier against the previously mentioned arbiter of favors. They were the network's largest source of viewings, since council business was deemed as very important by most members of pretty much all UGC species, since it could change the destiny of entire species, just like it did this day. Ali continued.
The offer is for the UEE to cede control of 50% of the Hyads cluster, supply the Hadzai Empire with 40% of the yearly production of the UEE-controlled half of the cluster for 20 years, and pay the Empire 5 trillion GMU a year for 50 years. In return, the UEE keeps control of the remaining 50%, and the Hadzai agree to a non-aggression pact. I urge the Hadzai to accept. This is the best concession offer the UEE has ever drafted. The alternative to acceptance is best left avoided.
With that, she turned to face Haydn and waited. The entire chamber was in shock. 5 trillion GMU was 5% of humanity's total yearly GDP without the cluster, and 50 years of that was 2.5 years' worth of their GDP. Or nearly 2 years' worth of the Hadzais. That alone was insane, let alone handing over half the cluster and giving them 40% of the production of the remaining half for 2 entire decades, in return for letting them keep the other half, and a non-aggression pact. Haydn and the Hadzai would truly be deranged to not accept such a deal. I was starting to get my hopes up when Haydn bared one of his characteristic smug grins as he stood and walked to face Ali from across the speaking circle. What was of important note, however, was that on one of his hips he had the Hadzai ceremonial sword. It was given to every Hadzai ambassador as a sign of office, but was usually only worn to council meetings, when the Hadzai were at or expecting to go to war. The fact it was still sheathed meant they were at peace. For now, if drawn, they were at war, and it wouldn't be sheathed again until whatever war they were in was over. On his other hip, he carried a bundle of Cardonian branches in an open-ended bag. They were seen as a rare symbol of peace among the Hadzai. This all but confirmed what I feared.
Ambassador Hansen.
He began, sounding like he already knew what the answer would be.
Your most recent offer is indeed incredibly generous. However, in the grand scheme of things, it is still less than what we already have. As we have already stated, Star Cluster 76GF is now Hadzai territory. Complete and permanent ownership of it is still worth more than what you offer. The only thing that is acceptable is the acknowledgement of this by the UEE.
With those words, he laid his hands on his waist.
I have an ultimatum of my own. On my person I carry both peace and war and can draw whichever humanity desires. Which shall it be, Ambassador Hansen?
The room stayed silent, all eyes on Ali. Mine were on her too, studying every part of her body language I could. I could not say which would be chosen, and though I knew the loss of the cluster would hurt the UE for the foreseeable future, I silently prayed for her to take the branches. Ali remained quiet for a while, her gaze fixed on Haydn. After about a minute, she turned to the committee podium and spoke.
Members of the committee, I wish to inform you that the UEE formally withdraws its request for arbitration in the light of recent events. We no longer see any purpose to their continuance.
She turned to face the seated members of the council, almost ignoring Haydn, who still grinned as if he had won. If only he'd known what we know now. It is here where Alexandra Hansen gave the speech. Yes, that one. The one recited every morning day on every channel of official human programming on every form of visual or audible media. I've heard it called the speech heard around the galaxy. I suppose it's a fitting name, due to its live nature and the possibility of a war involving humanity looming. More people from around the galaxy than ever before were watching the broadcast of this session of the Council, and no segment of live video made before or since has even come remotely close to the amount of eyes that were watching it. I believe I once read that 85% of the galactic population was tuned in. I don't really think I need to recite it. The recording of it is the most watched video, and its transcript is the most read speech in the Council's archives for God's sakes, but for posterity and continuity, I will.
My friends, for however long I may still call you that, I stand here before you, well aware of humanity's reputation. We know that the galaxy at large sees us as pushovers, weaklings who use diplomacy and concessions as a way to avoid being wiped out. Sure, our doubters say, humanity can fight a war when it's against a species smaller and weaker than itself, but if the big dogs came, they would cower in fear, powerless to stop their own demise. But far from being an insult, we see this as a compliment, for it shows we achieve the goal that every human strives to complete in its entirety every day, the goal of suppressing the dark hunger for violence in our souls. For dozens of centuries, humanity fought itself, first on our birth world, then on our colonies, wars on a scale none of you could even begin to comprehend. But over time, through immense amounts of suffering, literal oceans of blood, and over mountains upon mountains of our own dead bodies, we learned to control ourselves, to harness our raw emotions and redirect them to better strengthen mankind than to slowly destroy it. We did not know if we were alone in the universe, and if we weren't, if our neighbors would be as peaceful as we now strive to be. So we ensured that if the day were to come when humanity's well-developed and practiced skills of diplomacy, sweet talk, and cajoling failed, we would be more than capable of defending ourselves. And we are. Ambassador IR, you ask me whether humanity chooses war or peace. Let me set the record straight. Humanity sees no argument about the choice between peace and war. We will always choose peace, and we will choose it gladly, but that's not what's happened here today. Today, it is not humanity that's made the decision between peace and war. It is you, Ambassador ER, and your people. Every day for weeks now, we have given you the choice between peace and war, and every day you've given us the same answer. You have chosen no, demanded war. Humanity knows and does not believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery, which is surely what the intended outcome for humanity is, if this dispute ends the way the Hadzai wish it to. Humanity does have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay and there is a point beyond which they must not advance. Every human has hoped and prayed every day that the time would never come where we had to express those values. But that time has come, for the Hadzai have now forced our hand.
Hallie tapped a few buttons on the remote that each ambassador was given, and the massive multi-screen display that was mounted to the wall across from the council lit up. It was normally used to show one or two combined images, but now all of its 100 screens showed individual images. Only a few knew what they were images of. Chief among them was Ambassador ER, and every other Hadzai that could see them. I knew what they were too, due to my role as ambassador. They were live views of the Hadzai's largest and most important military installations and industrial complexes, taken from space and zoomed in, so as to show each of them in as much detail as possible. The shipyards on Kaldos, Hedek mine on the Hadzai's birth world, the largest producer of rare minerals in the Hadzai Empire. Half of them were on Azati, the largest of the Hadzai Empire's military-industrial worlds. There were only two possible ways they were being taken: from Hadzai satellites or... My throat became dry, and both of my hearts started beating hard in my chest. I did not know how it was about to happen, but I knew what was about to happen, although I couldn't believe I was seeing it. Allie's voice became flooded with emotion. She had been giving the proper inflection for what she had said so far, but I could tell that now her words were filled with anger, sadness, resignation, and perhaps even a tinge of madness.
Ambassador, you ask if humanity chooses peace or war. Humanity chooses peace, but you do not. The Hadzai choose war and have so deemed that humanity must choose it. Since that is the case, then the die is cast, and today, humanity is left with no other choice than to cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war.
Every person in the council chambers looked to another, in confusion and uncertainty. Suddenly, one by one, each of the images on the display would show a trail of smoke that appeared from off-screen and descended towards the surface. After a time, the image would be filled with a bright flash. Each time, it would fade away to show a growing orange fireball, before the image would flick away to another complex or installation where it would repeat. The entire chamber was filled with the gasps and cries of people that were witnessing, live, the most devastating first strike in galactic history. In total, the images of over 1,000 Hadzai industrial centers, mining operations, and military installations on 50 different planets were broadcasted live to the galaxy as they were turned into glass. It would later be estimated that in the span of 10 minutes, this first strike resulted in the deaths of over 500 million Hadzai military personnel. Ali swiftly surged forward, and gripping the handle of Haydn's sword, drew it from its scabbard, before he had a chance to react. He could only belatedly react in horror and fright as she whipped it around to hold its point against his throat, touching him but not drawing blood.
Ladies and gentlemen of the United Galactic Council, let it be known that from this day forth, the United Earth Empire and the Hadzai Empire are at war. I cannot say when this war will end, only that it will end with humanity still very much intact and the Hyades star cluster firmly in human hands. As for the fate of the Hadzai, I cannot say either, but I can assure you they will never be the same. However, do not think for a moment that humanity will come out of this unscathed. We will be just as changed, devastated, and broken as the Hadzai. Not physically, but spiritually. Our very souls will be forever torn asunder, never to heal. As for the rest of the galaxy, when you tell your grandchildren about this day, don't say we had another choice. The Hadzai's goal was clear. We offered them everything they could have asked for and more, and they spat on it. They wanted war to begin the annexation and subjugation of humanity. Well, they want a war. We'll give them a war. Ambassador IR, don't you tell your superiors I didn't warn you. As for the rest of you, I doubt that any of you will consider me or humanity a friend when this is over, if you even still do. I just hope that one day you will be able to do so again, that one day you'll be able to forgive us.
She withdrew the sword from his neck and let it drop to the floor, before turning and walking out of the council chambers. It was then that it suddenly struck me what was different about her. I don't know how I didn't notice it sooner. I doubt anyone that didn't know her as well as I did would have noticed the differences in how she stood, gestured, and the way she inflected her words. So many subtle differences that, when you knew what they were incredibly obvious. This realization struck me hard and stirred up my own emotions. I remember thinking that maybe this was how war affected all humans, even if the war had just started, or they wouldn't be directly involved in the fighting. Turned out I was right. The thing that was different about her was the kindness and warmth in her soul was gone. It had been replaced with anger. No, not anger. Cold, calculated, unrelenting, anguished rage. I can't tell you my name, but you can refer to me as Honcho. I don't have a problem with telling people my name, and many know it, but they've told me it's best not to do so publicly for my safety. I guess that makes sense. If the wrong Hadzai knew it, there might be trouble. Damn fanatics. Didn't enough humans and Hadzai die already back during the war? That also makes me wonder why Mr. Guerra's request for my participation in this history project of his was approved. But I guess it's all right. It'll be good to tell my story, and I guess things have changed enough since the war that I won't really be telling any military secrets. I was a part of the team that killed, or some say assassinated, the core of the old Hadzai royal family. I'll get to the core part later. Though I hate the term assassinated for our mission. The term has a connotation with it that implies criminal actions, like we were some hitmen for hire, or the target was targeted for political or religious reasons. We were a military team, tasked with eliminating high-level enemy commanders. That the Hadzai royal family was the central political force in the former Hadzai Empire was merely a coincidence. Now humanity found out long ago that just killing a people's leader or leaders won't always cause them to just give up. Hell, a lot of the time it just makes them fight even harder. We knew this, but the rationale at the time was that the Hadzai wouldn't be used to that kind of tactic, and that taking out their most protected people in one of their most well-defended cities in a heavily fortified building, right from the start, would give them a subconscious feeling of fear for the rest of the war, knowing that there was no place we could not reach. Plus, we already knew the Tempest was going to be apocalyptic. What was a few million more dead on the piles of billions because they fought a little harder? Anyway, my team was deployed just hours after the first day of arbitrations. Wanting everything to go as smoothly as possible, they gave us every piece of advanced tech we could ever ask for. NVGs that could turn night into literal day thanks to VI image processing. Those stealth blankets that bend light to make you literally invisible and completely undetectable, save for being run into. Hell, we were even given some of the first personal shield units, though they were still experimental back then. Obviously, ships had been using energy shields to protect themselves during warp travel for decades, but they were always far too power-hungry to size down enough so a person could carry one. I mean, the tech for making the shield projectors existed, just not the ability to power them for more than a few seconds with a power source lighter than a shuttle. That changed with the invention of the Morsi Carter fuel cell. Since the damn things were so versatile and so much changed with their creation, I'm not surprised their creators got their names on it. I had, and still have, no idea how they work. All I cared about is that a pair of them could power a PS for an entire day and provide the energy to absorb a lot of fire before the shield weakened to the point of uselessness at the same time. The exosuit required for a PS system was annoying, but after you got used to it, it was well worth the protection. Sorry, got off on a tangent. As I was saying, we were deployed to Hima, the Hadzai's birth world, before the second round of arbitrations started. By then, we had a pretty good idea of how things were going to go and wanted to be ready. In hindsight, I guess being so prepared for what was not technically a guaranteed war hurt us politically. But like the saying goes, better to be prepared than caught with your dick in the wind. Okay, that's not actually a saying, but it should be. Anyhow, we were taken aboard the ENS Beth McClellan, one of our small fleet of stealth frigates, and departed for Nadar, the Hadzai home system. The ride there was quiet. We busied ourselves with double, triple, and quadruple checking our gear. NVGs, PS systems, nav computers, weapons. I think I cleaned my M51 5 times. Oh, you might not recognize that name. It's an integrally suppressed assault rifle firing the subsonic 9x39 them around. Detachable mags between 10 and 30 rounds, 800 RPM fire rate, as quiet as a whisper, hard-hitting as a truck, and more durable than a Jadani hooker. Not sure if that last part will make it in, but whatever. My story, my words. About an hour before our arrival, my team's machine gunner, we'll just call him Mo, came to me. We talked for a while about the mission and just general small talk before he asked me a question that I was expecting sooner or later.
Honcho, you really think we'll be needed?
He asked. I let out a breathless sigh and replied,
I sure hope not. War's nothing but a lot of suffering for what could be worked out together, but if we are, then so be it. We've offered so much yet they refuse to cooperate. If they want to fuck around and find out, we'll oblige them.
Mo gave me a strange smile before replying,
I heard that.
We fist bumped, and he walked out of the room. See, as Alexandra Hansen said in the speech, we despise war. So many billions dead for nothing. Humanity would still be where we are if we hadn't slaughtered each other for centuries and just worked together, maybe even better off. Yet at the same time, we crave it. Conflict, I mean. Every bullet that's been shot, every bomb that's been dropped, every nuke that's been launched has been due to that craving. Violence is in the human soul. Yet at the same time, we want peace. We want to live in bliss and unity, to build for ourselves a grand civilization where all needs are met and all wants can be satisfied. Nonviolence is also in the human soul. That's the human condition. Being pulled in two opposite directions at the same time. There's always been people more inclined one way or another, but few, if any, have found the balance. Obviously, we still haven't and definitely hadn't either back then. We'd pulled too hard towards the peaceful side, and when we were forced to let go, we were like a loaded spring, and it cost us, and the Hadzai, more than anyone could have ever realized. Sorry, I'm rambling again. There's been enough talk of that stuff during and after the war that I'm sure everyone is plenty sick of it by now, and just want me to get to the killing part. My point is, while us in the military during peacetime are more than happy that we're at peace, the itch for violence in every human is just a bit more intense for us. A weird combination of being desperate for us to not be needed yet also aching for the chance to kill. That's why I say Mo's smile was strange. It showed both a desire for peace to continue and the urge to see what a Hadzai looked like after having a frag grenade go off at their feet. Anyhow, before I knew it, we arrived in system. Well, not actually in the Nadar system itself. The stealth system could absorb a massive amount of the ship's emissions for a long time, but the amount of energy released before, during, and after a warp jump was just too much, too quickly. So we dropped out of FTL, well outside of the system before, venting as much of our emissions as we could, and going cold. It took another couple of hours to arrive in orbit over the gas giant Kai, making sure we were out of sight of its two moons and the outposts on them. Without being able to physically see us, there was no way the Hadzai would know we were there. They still technically could. There's no way to stay hidden from all possible viewing angles out in space unless you fly into the atmosphere of a gas giant, which isn't possible while stealthed. But the risk of being visually seen from anywhere but Kai's two moons was deemed negligible. The Cyber Division guys had managed to hack a Hadzai satellite, so we had a real-time view of the Royal Palace, as well as the security cameras, and even got a full layout of the building. With those tools, we had planned our mission to perfection. We recorded guard movements and changes, decided on an infill and exfil point, found out where each member of the royal family would be at what time. Everything. The only thing we couldn't plan for was if and or when the order would come. That was up to Alexandra and the Hadzai. Thanks to our high security clearances, we knew what would happen if it came and had timed things out, so that right as the first shots of the first strike were being fired, we'd be going in. Now the question I'm sure you're asking is, how did we know when the order was given? Well, the answer to that is hiding in plain sight. The speech. Yep, that was it. Direct communication with command was impossible since a human signal to a HFY convoy would give us away, and there just had not been time to fit a warp communicator to the McClellan, not to mention how expensive those things are. But by linking the go order to the speech, all we needed to do was passively piggyback on the HFY's signals and watch the speech ourselves to get it. Yeah, we watched it live the same as most everyone else. Only difference was, when Alexandra started talking, we stopped listening. As the McClellan started moving, so did we. Gear was fitted and weapons loaded. Final checks were made. Once out of the shuttle, it'd really have sucked to realize we'd forgotten someone's NVGs or something. We were just arriving in orbit of Hima when we loaded into the shuttle, which I don't really need to say also employed the same stealth system as the frigates, and were popped out of the McClellan's cargo bay and into the atmosphere. When we reached about 40,000 feet altitude, we tuned back in using our helmet-mounted visors, just to make sure the order did come. Didn't want to end up landing on Hima, and it turned out something changed without us being told. The UEE military is the best in the galaxy, but no sentient creature yet created is completely infallible. Screw-ups have, do, and will happen. The war showed us that. Sure enough, she was just coming up on its end. When that cry havoc line came through our headsets, we jumped from the rear loading ramp and into Hima's atmosphere. Yeah, it was overdramatic, the line, I mean. But hey, humans have a flair for the dramatic. Anyway, it was night at the Capitol, so we made sure our NVGs were on. Thankfully, the HFY breathe almost the same atmo we do, save for having very slightly less oxygen and having different trace elements. So all the extra gear we needed to make a jump from 40,000 feet was an oxygen tank that we carried on our backs that was hooked into our face masks. Thank God for that, because we already had enough stuff strapped to us, our weapons, ammo, NVGs, the PS system, not to mention the heating system in our suits to keep us from freezing up there. We free fell for roughly 2.5 minutes, spread out enough so as not to interfere with each other. It felt just like every practice jump we'd ever done, simulated or otherwise. Once at the proper altitude, we popped our chutes. Our infill point was a section of one of the outer walls. We'd seen that only one guard would patrol it every few hours, and he'd just made his round when we boarded the shuttle. It was a hard target, only about 6 feet wide and with 2 giant towers on either end. But thanks to the nav system in our visors, we were given the perfect flight path to follow, so we'd land along its length without hitting a tower. I hit kinda hard, but nothing I wasn't used to. Mo and the other members of my team, Doc and Maze, had better landings, with Maze practically coming in and walking to a stop, like walking down a flight of stairs. Overachiever. Once down, we ditched the oxygen tanks and parachutes. We'd be leaving them since they weren't anything you couldn't already find on the civilian market. Once we'd readied our gear and turned on our PS units, we entered the tower in front of us, which led deeper into the palace. We knew exactly where the family would be. The main dining hall, eating dinner, and probably in the middle of shitting themselves after watching the speech. The first strike targets on Hima were on the other side of the planet, so we hadn't seen the flashes or fireballs, and we had plenty of time before the shockwaves would reach us. Many have wondered over the years why the Capitol hadn't been on the list of first strike targets. The answer is quite simple. We weren't looking to kill civilians for shits and giggles. All targets on that list were directly related to the HFY's war-waging ability, and at the time, the HFY had a strange system wherein the people that manned factories and mines were considered part of the military. We didn't understand why. We guessed some form of nationalization, but it did make it easier when those factories and mines went up in a ball of nuclear hellfire. While we obviously also looked to take out the royal family, nuking a city of tens of millions to get a couple dozen people wasn't worth it, and even an orbital strike would produce too much collateral damage. We needed precision. We needed my team. In any case, we moved through the royal palace, rapidly clearing hallways and rooms as we went. Speed was of the essence. While we believed the royal family wouldn't go to ground, we didn't want to take the chance. According to our surveillance, there would be few guards between our entry point and the dining hall. But few is not none. A couple rooms before our target, we entered a long hallway, and we opened the door expecting to find a pair of guards walking in the direction away from us, like they had every previous time we'd seen them on the security feeds at this time. Instead, the door opened to both of them, standing just on the other side, mid-stride and reaching for the door. Guess they forgot something or whatever. Their eyes had barely had time to go wide before Maze and I jammed our combat knives into their eye sockets. We dragged the bodies to the side and threw a blanket over each of them. Once hidden, we moved on. The next room was clear, but right as we started to open the door which would lead us to the hallway that connected to the dining room, the door behind us opened. Spinning around, weapons ready, we saw something. Or rather someone, we had not been expecting. Martau E.R., daughter of Ambassador E.R., and distant cousin of the then Hadzai Emperor, was standing in the doorway, eyes as wide as a planet. We must have been quite the sight. All dressed up in black uniforms, laden with high-tech gadgets, and armed to the teeth. We hadn't seen her on the security cams because, as we found out later, she had just arrived to visit her relatives. They say no plan survives first contact with the enemy. This is not always true, but in our case, it was. Now I had a decision to make, and about 3 seconds to make it. 1 second. The first thought was to let her go. In human terms, she was barely a teenager and wouldn't pose us a direct threat. Then the second thought was how stupid I was for thinking the first, since it was obvious the moment she was out of sight, she'd start howling about intruders. 2 seconds. We could just kill her. Dead men tell no tales and all, but that was just out of the question. We were not killing a teenage girl, enemy or not, just because she'd had the misfortune of going to the bathroom at the wrong time. There'd be plenty of wrong place, wrong time, deaths to come. And sadly, many of them would probably be civilians, but if my team could help it, it was not going to happen. And while she technically was a part of the royal family, we were going for the nucleus of the family, not its periphery. 3 seconds. She was also just far enough from us that had we lunged for her, she'd be able to turn and run down the hall behind her, and a wild chase would only drastically increase our chances of being more quickly detected. Time's up. Before I could make the decision, Maze made it for me. She threw her M51 at her. Martau caught it, but it gave the precious couple of seconds of distraction for Maze to also cross the distance and punch the poor girl right in the face. That knocked her out cold. Maze caught her as she fell and propped her against the wall before retrieving her rifle. We moved on. The next hallway was short, and when we opened the door, we saw the 2 Hadzai guards we were expecting outside of the door, apparently unperturbed about the disturbance that just happened. Their mistake. Before they could do anything, Maze and I hit them with 4 rounds of 9x39 each, 3 to the chest and 1 to the head. With our targets right on the other side of the door they were guarding, there was no need to hide the bodies. The fun would kick off soon enough. We stacked up on the door and looked at each other. This was what we were here for, and we were ready. Maze slung her rifle and threw one of the blankets over her front, tucking it under the back of her helmet to keep it in place before grabbing 2 flashbangs from her chest rig and pulling the pins, but keeping the spoons depressed. I opened the door. Me and the rest of the team, staying out of sight behind it, and the noise of the Hadzai royal family talking frantically to each other filtered into the hallway. From what I could tell, they were doing just what I thought they would be, shitting themselves at the typhoon they'd just started. Maze took a step in and rolled her flashbangs into the room, trying to get them about 1/3 and 2/3 the way in so as to cover as much of the room as possible. Just as I closed the door again, one of the HFY guards, somehow, heard the sound of them rolling on the floor, noticed the open door, and made some kind of noise of curiosity. The door shut and the flashbangs went off. Maze ripped the blanket off and threw it to the ground before bringing her rifle around. I swung open the door and we stormed inside. The royal family and their guards were clutching their heads from the shock of the bangs. They never had the chance to see us. There were 13 family members in the room: the emperor, his wife, 2 brothers, sister, 3 uncles, 2 aunts, and his 3 sons. The only people missing were his 2 daughters, who were elsewhere in the capital, and his 3rd aunt, who was on the other side of the planet, in mourning over the recent death of her husband. Plenty more of that would be happening real soon. There were also 8 guards, 2 at our door, as well as the other 2 doors in the room, and 2 more standing at the far end of the room, 1 at each corner. Just what we had planned on. Not much to describe here. We just cleared the room. Bullets flew, and when it was over, everyone but us was dead. None of them were able to overcome the shock to react to us, so describing to you as we aimed our weapons and pulled the trigger would be redundant. Now you may ask why we spared Martau, but not the Emperor's sons. Well, put simply, all 3 of his sons had come of age, and should everyone else in that room have died, but them. One of them would be next in line for the throne. As for his daughters and 3rd aunt, they just simply weren't there, and since HFY law prohibited females from taking up the throne anyway, it wasn't seen as necessary to take extra effort to eliminate them. Plus, as I've stated before, killing the entire family or preventing a new emperor from being crowned wasn't the goal. Intimidation was. Once we were finished, we replaced our now empty magazines, turned and ran. We knew it wouldn't be very long before 2 guards were supposed to come and check on the family, where they would find the bodies, and we needed to get out of there before then. We were ready for CQC if it happened, but it was better to avoid it if we could. We sprinted back the way we'd come, making sure to grab the blanket Maze had used and the 2 we left over the guards we'd killed. Couldn't let them fall into enemy hands. I got on the radio and called up to the shuttle that was still hovering where we'd jumped from it at 40,000 feet.
Fly, this is Cyanide. Mission complete. Require exfil over.
The 2 seconds it took for the pilot to respond felt like hours.
Roger, Cyanide. ETA 5 minutes.
Exfil was in the courtyard, and the quickest way there was actually back the way we'd come, through the tower and down through the one that had been behind us when we landed. We made it back to the next to last room before the tower, before all hell broke loose. Alarms went off, and we could hear the echoes of guards as they howled, both in mourning and anger for the royal family's deaths. We just kept on moving. When we got outside on the wall, the palace had become completely illuminated by lights, with a few floodlights filling the courtyard with revealing light. We knew that this would happen and were prepared for it. Doc, who preferred a suppressed M89 marksman rifle over the M51, settled his rifle on the stone railing and sniped out the lights. As I said, we knew the time for stealth was likely over, but if we could still somehow get out without killing anyone else or being noticed, we'd take it. We entered the tower and started bounding down the stairs. Before we could get to the ground floor, however, the door that led in from the courtyard opened, and looking down, we could see a small stream of 8 HFY coming up the stairs, likely to secure this section of the walls. With only 4 minutes, continued stealth was now definitely a no-go, as there was no time for fancy tactics or a different route. Mo took point and we continued rapidly descending the stairs. When the lead HFY and Mo came face to face, The Hadzai were far too slow to react, as Mo laid into them with his M76, the standard light machine gun at the time. Fitted with a suppressor and subsonic ammo, even that normally roaring 7.62x37 spewing beast was barely louder than some quiet talking. As he opened up, me and Maze leaned over the railing and unleashed a hail of fire on the Hadzai, lower down the stairs and behind the leaders. Between the three of us, we took them all out without them being able to get a shot off. We finished getting down the stairs and came out onto a small patio before coming down another small set of stairs to the courtyard ground. We were officially the first humans to set foot on actual Hadzai soil, but we didn't really care at that moment. I glanced at the time on my visor hoodie and saw that the shuttle should be landing in a minute. The place we'd chosen was on the other side of the courtyard, past the palace that took up a lot of the space within the walls. There was no cover between there and where we were, and since it didn't seem like the Hadzai knew where we were, we just sat tight. I kept my attention divided between watching for any movement and the clock on my HUD. 30 seconds, 25 seconds, 20 seconds. It felt like an eon passed before the quiet hum of the shuttle started to fill the air. With our ride here, we finally sprinted across the courtyard. I wondered why there were no Hadzai on the walls. Like the group we'd killed had surely been headed. I got my answer about halfway to the shuttle, which was just starting to descend into the courtyard. They'd been waiting in cover for us to show ourselves. In a moment, we were surrounded by the sound and impacts of dozens of Hadzai mass accelerators. Some were firing at the shuttle, but most were targeted at us. Unable to aim while running, we simply sprayed bullets at every Hadzai we could see. If we could kill them, good. If not, maybe get them to loosen their fire. Thank God we had those personal shields because they really saved our bacon. When the shield was hit, it would flare blue. Why blue? I don't know. Regardless, as we ran for the shuttle, I'm sure from a distance it would have looked like 4 blue balls surrounded by a small dust cloud moving along the ground with how much they were getting hit and how many shots were missing and hitting the ground. To the MCFC's credit, it kept the shields up through it all. We finally got to the shuttle. We practically dove into its rear ramp. While Doc closed it and the shuttle started to lift back off, I ran over to its side door to look out the window. Without us to draw their fire, everyone shifted their aim to the shuttle. We'd anticipated it, though, and the shuttle was a S-56, the M2 variant to be precise, the one meant for combat use, and thus heavily armored. Back then, shuttles didn't have shielding since they couldn't produce the energy needed and weren't warp-capable. Eventually, upsized versions of the MCFC would be introduced that could power said shields at useful levels, but at that time, they had just been invented. Even with just armor, though, it'd take more firepower than what semi-auto handheld accelerators, even 2 or 3 dozen, could put out in a short time in order to get through it. So, of course, they brought more firepower. As we started to clear the walls and the shuttle started forward, I watched as the top of the towers started to slide away and reveal the much larger anti-aircraft version of the Hadzai infantry's mass accelerator. Our stealth system had shielded the shuttle from detection while it was at altitude and would prevent the use of any targeting system, but they could still aim visually, which they did. The first shots went wild, as did the second ones, probably because they were trying to hit us too quickly and thus didn't aim well, but the third volley of shots were far more accurate. All but one still missed, but the one that didn't struck us right in the rear ramp. It passed clean through the ramp and exited through the ceiling. Thankfully by now, we were out of effective visual targeting range. They were still shooting, and some were close, but we didn't get hit again. Now, however, we had a problem. Or at least I thought we did. With 2 giant holes in it, the shuttle was no longer space or even high altitude capable. However, I was unaware that the Navy had thought of issues like this, though I don't know why. Seems like such an obvious thing to think about. Maybe the heat of the moment clouded my thinking. After setting a course to the frigate waiting in orbit, the pilot got out of his seat and came back to us. He politely asked us to, quote,
"Get the fuck out of the way, bang bangs."
When we did so, he retrieved a tool bag and a couple of steel plates from a container bolted to the floor. Going over to the hole in the ramp, he placed one of the plates over the holes, grabbed a plasma welder, and welded the plate in place before proceeding to do the same for the hole in the roof. When he was done, he returned the bag to its container and walked past us, muttering something about hurting a baby and Neanderthals. We all looked at each other and just erupted into raucous laughter. Dude was clearly upset over his shuttle getting damaged while getting us out. Funny how after a possibly deadly situation, one tends to laugh at the dumbest things. Once the laughter died off, we took our seats and just tried to let our bodies finally calm down. Things had gone as smooth as we could have hoped for. Our mission was complete, and none of the team was hurt. Since then, I've heard either talk about how the royal family could so easily be killed in their own fortress, or about how they could have done better defending it. But honestly, I give the Hadzai credit for their skill in patrolling the palace. The guard routes and schedule were tight, and there was virtually no way for us to have gotten in and out without being noticed at some point. I don't think even we could have done a better job with the same tools and knowledge the Hadzai had at the time. If it hadn't been for the detailed intel we'd been able to gather, we never would have been able to complete our mission without loss and/or a lot more bullets expended. When we arrived at the frigate, the shuttle was taken into the cargo bay and we immediately warped back to friendly space. No need to hide in hostile territory longer than we needed to. Once back in the Sol system, we were quickly debriefed at Pythia Station on Pluto. When that was done, we were immediately assigned a new mission and were told we'd be working in tandem with 3 other 4-person teams. That piqued our interest. It had been a while since a whole troop was assembled, so the mission must have either been massive or they were expecting heavy resistance, but whatever the mission was, we would be ready. I am Karan Yar, and I am the former fleet commander of the Nadar sector. Yes, I am the namesake for the battle most Hadzai call Yar's Folly. I, however, need to remind anyone reading this that this name for the battle is a post-war creation. At the time it was simply referred to as the Battle of System 6636HU by our people and the Battle of Earth by the humans. I had little reason to believe what I did would result in anything but victory. I made a mistake. I can see that now, but I will not apologize for my fervor in attempting to avenge the deaths of the royal family and take the initiative for the Empire in the war we had found ourselves in. I, along with the rest of the fleet, received the news about their deaths a few hours after that abomination of words called the speech. It obviously stuck all of us hard. Everyone looked at them with reverence. They were our spiritual leaders, the soul of our species. There was not a Hadzai alive I can think of that would have refused a request from them. We believed that without them, we would no longer have any direction as a people. Now, they were gone. A new emperor would be crowned eventually. There were still distant male cousins that could be sat on the throne, but they would never be able to fill the position quite the same. In the hours after this news spread across the empire, the communications net was completely saturated with messages coming and going from everywhere. Nobody knew what exactly we were to do. To describe how the empire worked, I'll use human terms as they seem to be more widely understood now. Sadly, few would understand me anymore if I used Hadzai ones. Officially, the empire was a unitary parliamentary semi-constitutional monarchy. However, in reality, the empire was a totalitarian military dictatorship. The Emperor technically held ultimate power, but through centuries of slowly acquired tradition, that control was rarely exercised anymore, and he had delegated much of his power to his inferiors. That led to a series of other technicalities. To put it as simply as I can, with the Emperor withholding the use of his power except on rare occasions, the tribes were supposed to be the leaders of the HFY Empire in the Emperors. Instead, but the military hierarchy held de facto power. The tribes had been reduced to a rubber stamp. They were the voice of the Empire, but the words spoken were the hierarchies. The closest government I've found that would be comparable is the government of the 20th century human nation called the Empire of Japan. Thus, with the military hierarchy practically obliterated and the royal family so thoroughly and ruthless slaughtered, the empire was most certainly leaderless. Both tribes, the tribe of commoners and tribe of elites, had mostly survived humanity's assault intact thus far. However, as I said, so long as a single male member of the royal family or a member of the military hierarchy survived, no HFY could ever consider them our leaders. The problem was figuring out which members of the hierarchy were still alive, and of them, who would have the authority and ability to lead our people. I'm sure this confusion was exactly what the humans were going for. Yes, I know what the human in the previous section of this little history book said. Being allowed to read what has been written so far was a requirement of my participation, but either he was lied to or just doesn't understand what he's talking about. The humans knew exactly what they were doing by murdering the royal family. With so much chaos and everything in disarray, the only thing I was sure of was the need to strike back. I felt that the longer we remained bickering amongst each other over technicalities in the law and what we should do next, the lower our chances of dealing with whatever the humans had planned next. The best way, in my view, to beat their next move was to strike them before they could make it. A preemptive attack of our own, if you will, to shift the initiative to us, and I had a perfect idea of exactly where and what we should attack. From what I could tell from the verifiable barrage of messages we'd received, nobody above the rank of fleet commander had survived. Or if they had not been heard from yet. So I decided to act. I put out a message into the swamp the net had become and hoped others would heed it. I informed everyone that I was taking command of the fleet and ordered all remaining ships that could make the journey to the home system to do so with all possible speed, as we would be attacking the humans' birth world in 3 days. 3 days sounds unrealistic, but I had no time to spare. The next human attack could happen at any moment. The plan was to gather all the ships I could, head to Earth, take out the Philadelphia naval yards and any UEE ships in orbit, and then orbitally bombard the tomb of Cyrus. They ripped the heart out of our species so I'd destroy the resting place of their most revered leader, while also depriving them of their best shipyards. An eye for an eye. However, as soon as I sent my message out, another message was put out by Fleet Commander Kin Baron of the Natara sector. This one was directly in opposition to mine. It ordered the fleet to disregard me and to hold their positions until things could be sorted out. This started a back-and-forth debate. As it intensified, things on the net calmed down. It seemed everyone decided to wait and see who'd come out dominant. I argued what I've stated previously, that we needed to strike back and take the initiative from the humans. He argued that it was exactly what the humans were expecting, that they were hoping we'd throw caution to the wind and come charging at them blindly. I know that now. With the war behind us, it's easy to say that obviously Kinbaran was right. I, however, remind everyone that I am not a fortune teller, and according to the information I had at the time, my plan stood a perfectly reasonable chance of succeeding. More than reasonable, really. Estimates showed that in 3 days, we could have nearly 2.5 sectors worth of ships ready to attack. With that many ships, any commander should have believed they would be able to overcome a single system's fleet. even a home system one. We even knew how many ships and of what kinds the UEE's home fleet had. We could beat them. I knew it. It was obvious. However, as I said, I will not apologize for my actions, but I will admit I wish I had waited just a day longer. Eventually, both me and Carberin realized the other could not be convinced. We left it up to everyone else. Whoever wanted to join whichever side could do so. With the hierarchy in its current state, neither of us yet technically had the legal authority to give orders to anyone outside of our respective fleets, yet so the decision would have to be left up to them. After 3 days passed, my force almost doubled to just under 2 sector fleets. The core was my own sector fleet, which was down to about 70% of its full strength, thanks to the surprise attack. The rest was made up of ships from every other sector fleet. Destroyers from Impbin, dreadnoughts from Limprian, even some cruisers from Carberin's own fleet joined us. Obviously, due to the distance, most of the ships came from the Kensar sector fleet since the sector directly bordered Nadar. Any ships from sectors beyond that were only there because they had been away from their sector at the time I put out the call for whatever reason. I contemplated waiting an extra day, but decided to stick to my plan. Once time was up and the ships were ready, we set a course for Earth and left to extract revenge. When we arrived over Earth half a day later, we were met in orbit by nearly the entire UEE home fleet. I was stunned. I had expected some ships, but not nearly the entire fleet. How could they have possibly known we were coming? You can follow a ship while it warps by knowing its heading and the disruption of space-time it leaves behind for a while, but no human ship had seen us leave. Then it dawned on me. They're stealth ships, particularly the one that had destroyed the Hidek mine. It had never left, but had remained in the Nadar system watching us. If that was the case, then that also meant that human ships were faster than ours, almost mind-bogglingly so. When we'd left, our intelligence had indicated that the UEE home fleet was still largely at dock at Mars and Earth. For them to have seen us leave, gotten to Earth ahead of us, and for the fleet to have organized so quickly, they would have had to have arrived less than a couple hours after leaving. It had also meant that the UEE had known we'd come and kept their ships on high alert, ready to deploy on a moment's notice. I had expected the latter. They had clearly been preparing for war for a while, but never considered they could move so fast. I forced the shock of these revelations to the back of my mind. None of that mattered now. We still outnumbered them by a large margin, and if we acted quickly enough, we could accomplish our goals and leave before reinforcements showed up. I assigned a couple dreadnoughts with a few cruisers and a destroyer escort to attack the Philadelphia naval yards, while the rest of the fleet engaged the UEE home fleet and pushed our way to position over the city of Cairo, where the tomb of Cyrus was located. When I gave the order, battle commenced. Human rail guns, which were more powerful than our ship's coil guns, were devastating in close combat and could easily punch holes in anything smaller than a dreadnought. To do so, however, they had to disable our shields. That meant using hordes of missiles, something the humans had plenty of. As our front line, composed of the Harbin, Metkar, and Janarus dreadnought groups, pushed into the UEE fleet, it was dazzling the amount of missiles that enveloped them. Our PDGs, the only chemically propelled ballistic weapon we employed by this time, were doing their best, but the sheer volume was overwhelming. I broke off several cruiser wings to try and flank the humans from below and divide their fire. The swarm slackened slightly, but not by much. It wasn't long before ships started to lose their shields and be torn apart by railgun fire from all sides. 2 of our dreadnoughts had been flying too close together, and an innovative human captain powered his own dreadnought down their length perpendicular to them, and, with their shields gone, fired his spinal railgun straight through both of them, hitting both reactors and destroying them. The humans weren't coming out unscathed, though. 4 of our cruisers surrounded a human dreadnought, the ENS Bahar, and pummeled its shields with hordes of unguided torpedoes. Our ships were designed for very close quarters fighting, and so we had deemed the guidance system unnecessary. Once its shields were gone, a mass of coil gun rounds forced their way through its armor and into its reactor. Overall, the battle was tough, but we were making headway. The UEE ships, through some very sophisticated maneuvering, managed to stay in front of us and continued to try and stop our attack, but were very much on the back foot. Our ferocious fighting was becoming too much for them. Over at the naval yards, our task force had managed to take out the small number of UEE cruisers and frigates defending them and were now pounding the individual docks' protective shields. It took about an hour, but soon enough the main fleet was almost within bombardment range of Cairo, and the naval yards were nearing destruction. Our morale, despite the heavy losses we were suffering, started to soar, and captains began to prepare their coil guns for orbit to surface fire, despite the remains of the UEE home fleet still engaging them in desperate battle. It seemed our superior numbers were winning the day. In an instant, everything changed.
Warning, multiple warp signatures detected.
Those words will forever haunt me. We were so close, and yet victory was ripped from our grasp. From above us, hundreds of ships of the human Fifth Fleet warped in, drove straight down, and like a spear, stabbed right through the heart of our formation. We were completely taken by surprise as dozens upon dozens of our ships lost their shields from a tsunami of missile fire, and were subsequently riddled with railgun slugs, many shots finding their target of our reactors. To quote one UEE veteran's recollection of seeing this counterattack.
Then the Fifth Fleet appeared above the Hudzai fleet and dove in on them like the cavalry charging to the attack. They clashed, and within minutes, the Hudzai crumbled like a dry cookie.
Within a very short span of time, what had been the makings of a great victory had been turned into an incredible defeat. It was quite clear that the fight was lost. Now it was our turn to be outnumbered, and we were very quickly surrounded. The few dozen ships left continued to fight, but I knew it was no use and gave the order to retreat. I sat in my command chair and started to put my head into my hands in mourning for our defeat when my navigator informed me that the warp drive wouldn't engage. I snapped back to attention and asked him why. When he couldn't give an answer, I then asked if the remnants of the fleet had managed to get away. I hoped that even if I couldn't follow them, at least they could get back and tell Kinbaran of what happened. I became enveloped by fear, surprise, and confusion when the fleet also could not seemingly engage their warp drives. Left with no other options, I must stress that point, I ordered our remaining ships to cease fire. Some since the war have tried to claim I gave this order as an act of cowardice. Though I was willing to die to avenge the Emperor, I did not consider it cowardice to surrender when continued fighting would not achieve anything to further that goal and would only lead to our deaths. Perhaps if we surrendered, they may keep us prisoners somewhere we could escape and maybe find some way to hinder their plans. It didn't happen, but I believed it was a possibility at the time. Our ships obliged my command, though I would find out shortly that many wanted to keep fighting and only obeyed my order because they believed I had some master plan to escape our predicament or turn the tables in our favor. How they thought I would accomplish such a feat when we were outnumbered more than 10 to 1, and all of our ships were damaged in some way, many heavily. So I do not know. I have spent the years since the war consulting with every expert on warfare that will speak with me, humans obviously included, to see if there was something, anything, I could have done differently at that point, both with the knowledge I have then and what I have now. The answer has always been a resounding no. To my relief, the humans returned the favor and ceased fire as well, though sensors showed they were still very much ready to blast us into pieces. A request for communication was pinged to us, and I answered it. Due to audio recordings by the humans, I can relay to you word for word how the discussion went. Gara has asked that I do so in the interest of a more complete record. It brings me great pain to relive the worst moment in my life, but I shall, while also relating to you how I felt and what I thought at the time.
Fleet Commander Yar.
A human male voice boomed through the bridge speakers.
Your ships are in no shape to fight. I'm assuming your cessation of fire means you intend to surrender.
Before he could continue, I interrupted him.
Before I give my answer, could I have the honor of knowing the name of the man I am speaking to?
His reply was very off-putting. I had always believed humans would speak very formally in such instances as this one, but his reply was so casual, vulgar, and sarcastic. It very much caught me off guard.
Sure you can. My name's your daddy, and I'm the one who just spanked you for being a naughty boy.
I could hear the laughter and snickers of his bridge crew on the other end. I was so confused by his answer that I could not reply, and when I didn't, he continued after the laughter had died off.
Jokes aside, I am Admiral Daniel Wilters of the UEE 5th Fleet. As I said, I'm assuming you wish to surrender. If you don't, then I suggest you prepare to be annihilated. You have 10 seconds before we open fire again.
My bridge crew looked to me, but I could not look them in the eyes as I replied.
My fleet is at your mercy, Admiral.
He snorted, as if he was irritated.
I know it is Commander Yar. That's not what I asked. I asked if you were surrendering.
I realized what he had wanted me to do. He wanted me to actually say the words. I was in no mood for games, so I obliged him.
Yes, I am surrendering myself and my fleet.
We were talking via audio communication, so I could not see him, but I knew he had to be smiling as he spoke.
Roger that, Commander. Power down your reactors, drop your shields, and prepare to be boarded. We are watching you intently. If you try anything, and I mean anything, my fleet will turn yours into twisted scrap metal.
I turned to my comms officer and told them to relay the message. He wanted to protest, but didn't. Once the message had been relayed and followed, we waited in near silence. While our main reactor was off and the larger backups were as well, a small auxiliary one remained on to provide life support and critical systems like sensors and communications. Thanks to those sensors, we watched as one by one our ships powered down, except for 6 of them, 2 of which were some of our remaining dreadnoughts. I demanded an answer for why they weren't following orders. The reply was simple, and one I guess I wasn't surprised by.
For the Emperor!
They surged forward and opened fire with whatever weapons they had left at anything they thought they could hit. They didn't last long. The UEE ships returned fire, and the mutineers just disappeared. Even from my position, the hail of missiles and railgun slugs could have blotted out the sun had they been closer together. Once they were gone, the UEE locked their weapons back on us but didn't try to ask why that had happened, once again showing that they didn't merely murder the royal family for intimidation, no matter what that honcho man claims. They knew it had been fervor and the desire for revenge that drove those ships to attack in a hopeless situation. The humans dispatched their large personnel shuttles and boarded our ships. Admiral Wilters came in person to formally accept my surrender. A few of my ship's crew tried to resist being taken, but were either subdued or, in the case of violent resistors, shot. Since the war, this has been portrayed as a war crime, as if that word even applies to such a minor thing anymore, by imperial fanatics. While I didn't appreciate it, I have to admit, it was justified self-defense. We'd have done the same thing. As my men were being loaded onto the shuttles, my bridge crew had been allowed to stay to operate what systems were needed while the evacuation was underway, under human supervision, of course, which included Admiral Wilters. Right before the evacuation was complete, strange readings started to come in from our remaining dreadnought. We quickly realized what they had done. With subtle use of thrusters, they had managed to drift close to a group of human cruisers and their dreadnought leader. Then they restarted their reactor, but had gone about it the wrong way, and it was now set to overload in less than a minute. Wilters didn't need to relay this to his men, as they could also tell, and had started to move out of the way. Before they could do so completely, the reactor went critical. The human dreadnought had been too slow and was largely caught in the blast, critically damaging it. The cruisers, however, were luckier and suffered only medium damage. Wilters demanded an answer from me, but I told him I had not told them to do such a thing, since, if I had, it would have been a fleet-wide act, not just one ship. He accepted the answer, but the evacuation of the ships was sped up, and before long, they were empty hulls floating in space. As I rode a shuttle to Earth, I asked Wilters why my ships were unable to escape using warp. He merely chuckled and didn't answer. He was a smart man and didn't want to risk the method getting out, even if our escape was improbable. If we had found this out back then, it very well could be changed the course of the war. I will openly admit my understanding of the following subject is pretty limited. I very well may have things completely wrong, even if I understand the overall effect. If you wish to understand it better, it is best to do your own research. I learned after the war that humans had discovered a naturally occurring particle they called Hartmann particles. They interact with space-time in such a way that they could, in theory, disrupt it, if the concentration of them was great enough. They are usually so thinly concentrated that their interaction with space-time is practically unnoticeable. Due to this, they generally have no real effect on warp travel, which of course relies on essentially bending space-time around a vessel to allow it to bypass the normal mass and energy conundrum that restricts objects with mass to below the speed of light. As I said, however, in great enough concentration, they could disrupt space-time and so interfere with a warp drive's ability to bend space-time, thus rendering warp travel impossible. The humans had found a way to collect these particles in a special form of containment that allowed a vessel carrying them to still use warp travel. Since before the war, they had been collecting these particles and had enough of them to start using them if they so desired as a way to prevent warp travel within a certain area. After they'd been used, they could be recollected for future use and to re-enable warp travel in that area. It has been questioned how the wider galaxy had not discovered these particles sooner and how the humans had been able to hide their discovery and collection of them. I cannot speak for the former. Maybe it was because the galaxy didn't feel the need to find a way to restrict warp travel, or believed doing so would be too damaging to the environment. I do not know. As for the latter, however, the answer is simple. They lied. They disguised shipments of Hartmann particles by labeling them as, and saying they were, other things. Shipments of minerals, other scientific materials, pig shit. Whatever they deemed would be a good cover story. They stockpiled them for just the right moment, and when it was time, they distributed containers of Hartmann particles to the ships of the home fleet. While we were pushing through their lines, they used their maneuvering to stay in front as a cover for pouring them out across the battlefield. It was like a bear trap for us to walk right into, and when we did, we would be snared and unable to escape. Of course, I knew none of this at the time. All I knew is that I had just led 2/5 of our remaining fleet into what was essentially an ambush, though one the humans had not intended to go as it did. They had expected us to make a swift counterattack, knew where it would come from, and what its target would be, but had underestimated how hard we would fight. The intervention of the Fifth Fleet had not been planned. They had expected the home fleet would be enough to win the day and had hidden the remaining ships of the fleet behind Luna, Earth's moon, to then strike us in the back. The Fifth Fleet had been on exercises and came to assist the home fleet when they received word of the attack, even though they hadn't been ordered to do so. Thus those ships were no longer needed and had diverted to deal with our ships attacking the naval yards. Our men fought to the bitter end and were destroyed completely. What I wish I had known before the battle, I'm glad I didn't know immediately after it. And what pained me after the war to learn was that in less than a day, The Fifth Fleet had been planned to be redeployed in preparation for the human offensive into Star Cluster 76 GF. Had I just waited one more day, it's unlikely they would have been able to arrive at Earth in time to prevent us from bombarding the tomb of Cyrus. We had been so close. At least the defeat would have accomplished something. As I was saying, the transports were headed to Cairo, both to process us as prisoners of war, but also to give us a glimpse of the thing we had been aiming to destroy. The tomb of Cyrus was an amazing sight. I knew this even before the war, as I had done a bit of studying of major landmarks on Earth, and the tomb of Cyrus was most certainly a major landmark. It was a massive structure, built like ancient human castles. It towered above everything before it, and yet was constructed in such a way that it appeared that the planet itself had built it. Sand curved up its walls and laid piled on its battlements. It was meant to symbolize that the earth itself mourned his death and desired to protect his body. Considering the importance we would later find Cyrus, the first and only emperor of mankind, had for human history and their current state, it is fitting. As the sight of the tomb loomed in the window, I turned to Admiral Wilters and asked him how could humans have been so ready for and capable of making war, when their last one had been waged by their great-grandparents. How could they be so warlike and yet so peaceful and forgiving to their alien acquaintances? He looked at me, and what he said next I will never be able to forget.
We humans have a saying. It's an ancient one originating from a now practically extinct language, si vis pacem para bellum.
He turned to look at the tomb.
If you want peace, prepare for war.
I could only look at him in silence. The revelation that humanity hadn't just been preparing for war for a few months, but really had been doing so since their last one wasn't much use to me now. I would spend the remainder of the war as a prisoner in a camp on a planetoid the humans called Sedna. It was a dreadful place, and one of which I will not speak of. If there is a hell, it is that icy rock floating in the middle of nowhere. All that matters is that's where I would spend the forthcoming years along with so many other middle and high-ranking HFY personnel, far from the warmth of a star and practically unknown to the rest of the galaxy. If only I had waited one more day. The funniest joke I have ever been told is humanity was prepared for the war. Sure, we struck first with a coordinated nuclear attack on 1,000 different military and industrial installations spread over 50 different planets at the same time. We had a counter to the HFY's predictable attack on Earth. We destroyed half the HFY Navy, an overall third of their military, and a quarter of their industry. So what? The Hyades cluster was still in HFY hands. That didn't change. What no outside observer seems to have considered at the time or now is what needed to happen after those things occurred to make any of it mean a damn thing. Sure, we were ready to fight, but I wouldn't quite go as far to say we were prepared for the fight. Not in the way many seem to think, at least. Fact is, fancy tactics alone don't take star systems. Soldiers with guns do, and while we had a sizable military and stockpile of gear before the war, we started out already outnumbered, and we knew the problem wouldn't resolve itself. We needed more. A lot more. Those soldiers and their guns don't just come from a magic portal, however. They have to be recruited. Then each of those soldiers needs to be housed, clothed, fed, trained, paid, transported to the battlefield, and, of course, given that gun. To do that successfully on a scale in the millions is a skillful feat. To do it on a scale in the hundreds of millions is an incredible feat. To do it on a scale in the billions in just a few months is a feat of supernatural skill and organization. I should know I've done it. My name is Stuart Sisko, former head of the United Earth Empire's Ministry of War. In the lead-up to the war, the UEE military numbered roughly 800 million, both active and reserve, between all the branches. Before we blew 500 million of them into dust, the HFY had about 1.7 billion. We had nearly evened the odds, but once they recovered, we knew the numbers game would begin. That's where they would have us. We didn't allow those under 18 to serve, while the Hadzai saw no problem in letting people as young as 13 years old fight, thanks to their warrior culture, so they could put a larger total of their population on the field than we could, aided by their larger population. However, it would take both sides time to build up their forces, and building up military and industrial power quickly was something humanity had gotten exceptionally good at. The declaration of war naturally caused many to rush to recruitment centers, eager to defend their species. Across the empire, we probably had somewhere close to 500 million applications for service within a week. We had to weed some out. The enthusiasm was appreciated, but an overweight woman with a heart condition just doesn't have a place in the military. Of those 500 million, about 100 million had to be turned away, though we did make the point that if they still wished to serve their people and help the cause, they could see about getting jobs at armament plants, fuel refineries, places like that. Lord knew we were going to need a lot of ammo if we were going to be doing much of anything. Hundreds of millions more applications came, but after another 3 weeks, it was clear it wouldn't be enough. We didn't blame people for not jumping at the chance to experience war firsthand, but we would need the numbers and fast. So we got to drafting. All men between the ages of 18 and 30, and all women between 21 and 25, were legally required to sign up for the draft and to keep an up-to-date record of their physical health. This was usually done when one would have their twice-a-year checkup at their family doctor. The first wave consisted of mostly men, though the most physically fit women were conscripted too. That added around 1.5 billion, bringing our total to about 3.5 billion within a month and a half. For perspective, the Hadzai only managed about 2.6 billion in the same time despite their larger population. We could have added more, but there was no point if they couldn't be trained, because of course just showing up at someone's door and telling them they're going to war doesn't mean they're suddenly a combat-effective soldier. At the same time, we made sure our training centers were fully staffed and prepared, while we also built new ones, along with barracks complexes the size of small cities. Within the first month, we had increased the number of people who could be trained and housed at a single time to about 1 billion. 3 months saw it increase to 2.5 billion. It would take about 4 to 6 months to whip them into fighting shape, but at least they were in the pipeline. Then came the task of making the things they would need. Everything from ships and tanks to clothes and body armor to the paper they'd use to wipe their asses. Our stockpiles were large, but some of it was disgracefully obsolete, at least by our standards. We even had some original model M4 tanks in storage. Can you believe that? A tank, a decade out of date. Good thing that design had been made with upgradability in mind. Thankfully, we had long ago perfected the art of mass construction, as demonstrated by our construction of hundreds of new training facilities at the same time as building thousands of new factories, producing everything from toilets to guided missiles. Within a month, the number of rifles we could produce doubled. Another 3 months saw it quintuple. Guns, ammo, uniforms, MREs, tanks. We were quickly drowning in supplies and equipment, and were now ready to supply an army of billions with everything they could need. They'd need a way to get their new gear to the battlefield, though, and it's here where things developed much slower. Ships take much longer to build than a gun, obviously. Thanks to automation, though, we could still build ships in months, rather than years. We put in orders that would triple the size of our Navy within a year. We also accelerated plans for newer ships. Most of our current designs were nearing what we saw as obsolescence, still mostly better than their Hadza counterparts, but not enough for our liking. It would be a while before they were ready to be produced, but as I said, our current designs would be enough for the time being. Now came the truly hard part. Paying for it all. After all, patriotism can take you far. But at the end of the day, these men and women had families to feed. While we did do the normal thing of allocating more of our budget to the military, we predicted we'd default on our debt within 5 years if we relied on just that avenue. Raising taxes bought us some time, but that wouldn't be enough either. So we also decided we'd need to start issuing war bonds. The sooner the better. I love war bonds. Such a useful concept. Not only did they enable us to pay for the war without using crushing taxes, they also helped to control the inflation that was sure to come from our economy becoming overstimulated due to the war. We knew they would be a hit, but even our most optimistic numbers were blown out of the water. So much money came in via war bonds that we were even able to reduce taxes back to pre-war standards and pull back slightly on the budget, at least for a while. Anyway, all in all, I must admit I'm proud of the job we did. We went from a peacetime economy to a full-blown war economy in just 9 months. Of course, we were helped immensely by plans that had been drawn up decades prior and resources we'd been stockpiling for even longer. We also wouldn't have been able to construct a third of the number of factories in the time that we did if it wasn't for the advent of the Kuwait prefab building. Still, it was most certainly a feat that hadn't been performed before in human history, even during the final war. Things would get even larger, obviously. We are talking about a war where the number of people just wounded in some physical war-related way would total in the tens of billions after all. For the time being, though, it was enough to get us started. All we needed was for our pre-war forces to hold the line. A.N. Chapter 7 is here. Better late than never, right? Been a month since my last post, busy with work and remodeling my basement. Plus, I'm having a big party next weekend, so I've been looking ahead to that too. Time really just got away from me. I kept saying, think I'll get some writing in, and then got distracted and forgot. Rinse and repeat about 20 times, and here we are, LOL. Wrote up this chapter in about a week. Much smaller than the last few, but mostly because I didn't want to get too deep into numbers because they'd make no sense anyway. Haha. Still, I hope I got the message across I wanted to. Humanity is a powerhouse of galactic proportions, and the HFY are going to be in a world of hurt. Pretty soon. The road ahead is long, though, and humanity's going to have some bumps along the way. We'll get there in time, though. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoy it, and I'll see you in the next one. The week after Ali gave the speech was strangely calm. One would have expected that after the unprecedented first strike and declaration of war by the UN that chaos would reign. That was not the case, however. Even the day after, when the council began session, everyone seemed to be trying to go about things as normal. Only Haydn acted differently. He practically stared at Ali during the entire session. For her part, Ali seemed to be going about things as normal, too. She seemingly never paid him any mind. This went on for several days. I suppose everyone was still trying to process what had just happened. They were soon broken out of it when news came about the failed HFY attack on Earth. It was relayed in the middle of that day's session. Haydn left when it hit, but Ali seemed unfazed. The next day is when the effects fully showed themselves. When roll was taken for the session, Ali was absent. Haydn seemed to take her absence with suspicion, but I can't be certain. Then, 2 hours into the session, she appeared. Everyone went silent for a moment. As she reached her seat, she sat down as if she hadn't just walked into the middle of a council meeting. Before anyone could say something, Ali announced she was sorry she was late, but she had a pressing issue that had to be dealt with. A few more seconds passed before the council returned to business. Things proceeded mostly as normal until we reached the part of the day's session where individual ambassadors could bring up issues they believed pressing and important enough to warrant the council's attention. Somewhat unsurprisingly, no one spoke up. Everyone could obviously tell that Allie probably had something big to talk about and decided their business could wait. She hit a button on her remote to indicate she wished to speak, which was answered positively by the supervisor panel that oversaw each session. For those that somehow don't know, each council session is overseen by a group of 6 ambassadors called the supervisor panel that oversee each session to ensure protocol and decorum are adhered to. Each day's panel is chosen at the close of the previous day's session by a computer scrambler that randomly selects 5 ambassadors out of the current council. If a member is chosen and is unable to show up the next day, another random choice is made by the computer of those present at the start of that day's session. The 6th member, called the first counselor, is chosen by a full council vote at the beginning of each year to serve on the supervisor panel for the duration of that year to try and ensure at least one supervisor is present to begin each council session, to give a feeling of continuity between meetings, and to keep a record of all council proceedings. They also have the ability to end a council session early or call an emergency meeting. The only requirement is the member must have been on the council for at least 10 years. The first counselor is able to appoint someone, called the second counselor, to take over their place for the remainder of a year, should they not be able to perform their duties for whatever reason. Very rarely, a more devious member might get selected, but generally, the first counselor is someone greatly respected by the rest of the council. Every species ambassador is open to being selected for either the supervisor panel or the first counselor position, as long as they meet the 10-year requirement for the latter. Getting back to what I was saying, once Allie was recognized by the supervisor panel, she stood and walked to the speaking circle. Once in the circle, she turned to face the council and spoke.
Good day, my fellow ambassadors. I have requested to speak in front of the entire council so that what I'm about to say has a public record.
She then turned to look at Haydn.
Ambassador Iarge, please join me. You must be able to hear what I'm about to say clearly, so there'll be no misunderstandings.
Haydn, who had again kept his eyes glued to Allie, stood from his seat and walked to stand across from her in the circle.
What is it, human? Wish to gloat?
He spat, arms folded. Allie didn't acknowledge the anger in his voice when she spoke.
Ambassador Ear, once your Navy's fleet was defeated in the recent action over Earth, one of your vessels used the cessation of fire to subtly move themselves close to some of the vessels they were surrendering to, so as to attempt to damage or destroy them via detonating their reactor.
Before she could continue, Haydn cut her off.
I am aware they gave their lives for the Empire and did what they could to inflict as much damage on their opponents as possible.
Ellie continued to maintain impassive eye contact with Haydn.
Yes, we know that was their intention. We're also now aware such suicide attacks are not covered by the conventions of war followed by Council species. It has been several decades since our species joined the galactic stage. Yet in all that time, we failed to realize just how different the Council is from us in some areas. In our haste to make friends and fit in, we neglected to fully vet all laws regarding war followed by the Council. At the time, we didn't see it as necessary. We naively believed that such advanced races would surely have the same attitude about the waging of war that we did. Obviously, we were wrong. In light of the fact that the galactic rules on war come up lacking, we've decided that we should share our own and insist that they be followed to the letter.
She pulled a communicator out from her pocket and depressed the talk button.
Bring them in.
As she put it away, the doors to the chamber opened again, and 3 men each wheeled in a cart stacked with several boxes. They brought them to Ollie before saluting her and leaving.
These are boxes of data pads. Each pad contains the full contents of a particular agreement regarding war. Combined, they have a complete record of every convention, accord, compact, and covenant that has been accepted by the majority of humanity regarding when, where, how, and why war can be and is to be conducted since before we left our planet. The oldest of them dates back to Earth year 1899. At the end of our last war, despite the UEEs being the only remaining government, a grand overarching convention was created. It integrated all of these and expanded on them to create a single document called the Convention Regarding the Restrictions on and Regulations Concerning the Conduct of War, more commonly referred to as the Rules of War. We created it in case humanity broke into multiple governments again. We are giving you copies of each convention individually, as well as a copy of the complete version of the Rules of War, so that there cannot possibly be any more breaches of them.
Haydn eyed the boxes before walking up and opening one. One by one, he pulled the data pads out. The box contained 15 data pads. Between the 3 carts, there were 18 boxes. That meant there were 270 data pads if each box was filled the same way. About the time I figured this out, Haydn did too. I still remember the look of shock on his face when he did. He was nearly speechless, only able to ask why there were so many. Ali's response was simple.
We've had a long time to figure out and experience every possible dirty tactic.
It took Haydn a few moments to process this, but once he had, his response was what I expected it to be.
Ambassador Hansen, your people may follow these rules, but ours don't. Unless ratified by the Council, the HFY Empire has no obligation to follow any of your rules of war.
At his response, Ali took a step closer to him and leaned on one of the stack of boxes. She spoke with cold emotion that made my skin crawl with fright.
Ambassador, I will say this only one time. Follow these protocols, or in accordance with Chapter 9, Section LP, Paragraph 31 of the Rules of War, humanity will be free to retaliate with equal or greater force on the assumption that the offending party, in this case the HFY, no longer desire the protections of these rules.
Haydn tried to counter with an argument about humanity's use of nuclear weapons in their first strike. Ali merely replied that the nuclear weapons they use produce essentially zero radiation and are thus nothing more than extremely powerful conventional explosives. Official analysis of the affected areas by Council-sanctioned vessels, ordered 2 days after the opening of the war and with no objection by humanity, showed this to be true. He then switched to humanity's pre-placement of stealth vessels to launch their attack. Ali countered by pointing out there was nothing wrong with preparing to defend oneself when an attack seems to be imminent, and that such preparatory actions and preemptive first strikes were acceptable under human law and even galactic law. She also mentioned that the speech was considered as the lawful notice of the declaration of war, and all the notice that the HFY needed that they had started a war, considering their actions during its lead-up. Before he could continue his unprovoked debate, Ali raised her hand to stop him.
Enough, Ambassador Yar. I am not here to debate these rules or defend our actions thus far. I'm merely giving you the rules. It is up to your people whether or not to follow them. I can assure you, however, if you do not, the HFY people will regret that decision for the next century or more. Do not force our hand more than you already have. You have 1 week from today to read these rules and report any violation that was made before this date. They will be forgiven on the grounds of lack of knowledge. Any unreported breach discovered after this 1-week deadline will be treated as grounds for implementation of Paragraph 31. I'll say it one last time. Follow our rules of war, or you'll find out why we have so many.
She then turned to the supervisor panel.
I will end my time.
As she returned to her seat, Haydn took a moment to collect himself before summoning assistants to take away the carts of data pads and returning to his seat, seemingly in deep thought for once about Ali's warnings. A couple other species ambassadors took the stage to voice their problems. but I could tell most were wondering exactly how violent humanity's history had to be for them to be able to fill 270 Wedetapadza with treaties and agreements on how war was fought. When the day's session was over, I immediately went to visit Ali to find out. I learned much more than I could have imagined. I managed to catch Ali before she left her office for the day. She invited me in and I sat in the chair across from her.
Afternoon, Genta. Been a while since you and I talked privately.
She reached into one of her desk drawers and pulled out 2 glasses and 2 small bottles. She poured each of us a drink from the different bottles and slid mine to me across her desk.
How have you been?
Okay, I suppose.
I answered, while taking a whiff from the glass before taking a sip.
Things have been interesting lately.
She chuckled before taking a drink and replying.
Yeah, I imagine the war is filling everyone's thoughts, not just humans. In just the last 5 minutes, I've gotten requests from 17 different ambassadors for their own copy of our rules on the conduct of war. I guess I don't blame them. 270 conventions is a lot to be dedicated only to the conduct of war, and if we don't see a nuclear first strike as a war crime, what do we see as one? Of course, as I said, and was proven, our nuclear weapons are incredibly clean, which is thanks to their nature as fusion weapons and the fact that we airburst them.
She sighed and took another drink.
I'm sorry, Genta. It's only been a week and I'm already feeling the strain. It feels like I have to justify every decision I'm making and every word I'm saying. I might not be doing any fighting, but being the human ambassador means I bear a lot of burden. During times of war, such as this, I am given unilateral power in diplomatic matters, even with species we're not at war with. I give the word, and we stop all trade with the Icar, or we embargo the Milia. I can even start another war with another species without first consulting the UEE government. Of course, when it's all over, my decisions would be questioned and analyzed. If it was found I used that power for anything but humanity's best interests, there would be consequences. Those could range anywhere from mere loss of position and fines all the way up to the death penalty.
I merely sat and let her vent. I knew she wasn't a naturally power-hungry woman, so the stress of having such power was definitely wearing on her, even in those early stages of the war. Still, compared to what she was going to become, sometimes I wish Jadani didn't have perfect memories. Once she was done, I decided to ask what was on my mind.
Ali, would you mind if I asked you something?
She gave me one of those perfect smiles of hers, which made asking what I was going to even harder than it already was.
Sure, Genta, whatever you want to know.
I took in a deep breath and finished my drink before pouring myself another.
Ali, humanity has been on the galactic stage for over 30 of your years. In that time, this vast history of warfare you say your people have has never really come up. There have been a few that have claimed that humanity's wars before first contact were devastating, but nothing of real note could be found on the extranet or human media. Why is that? Why, or perhaps how, has humanity hidden that history from the galaxy? If your wars were as destructive as those few conspiracy theorists have claimed, knowledge of them might have prevented this war from happening at all.
Her smile dropped for a minute, and she strongly exhaled through her nose.
I guess the cat'll be out of the bag sooner or later, and seeing as how you're a good friend, you've earned the right to know. But first...
She leaned back over to grab something from her desk drawer. When she set the bottle on the desk, I could quickly tell it wasn't her normal Jack Daniels. The hue of the liquid was off. She noticed me trying to discern what it was and gave a sly smile.
If I'm going to talk about our history of war, I'm gonna need something a bit stronger. This is Jack Daniels, but not the stuff I normally drink, which is old number 7. This is Jack Daniels Single Barrel Proof, the 70% variety. I spent a lot of money to track this down, but now's as good of a time as any to drink it.
She poured herself some and downed it. Her face immediately contracted into a strange look of pain, yet also enjoyment. She lightly slapped her desk once before shaking her head slightly.
Whew, now that's some good strong whiskey.
She stood and walked over to the small mini fridge, sitting in the corner of the room. Opening it, she pulled out a couple of ice cubes from their bin and put them in her glass before returning to her seat and filling the glass with more of the drink.
Alrighty now, where to start? I suppose I should explain why humanity has been so guarded about its relationship with warfare. To be frank, we're embarrassed about it. We killed each other in the billions over petty squabbles when we would be so much more advanced if we had just worked together. We would have developed warp drive earlier and likely have discovered the wider galaxy first instead of it finding us.
As she paused to take a drink, I took my chance to interrupt politely.
Ali, what do you mean by in the billions exactly? Just how devastating were your intra-species wars?
She seemed to think about it for a bit before grabbing what appeared to be a datapad beside her and began tapping on it.
Genta, you're about to be the first non-human to officially be given access to a hidden human network that is separate from the galactic extranet. You see, before the galactic extranet, humanity had its own widely available globe-spanning informational network. It was later expanded to include the entire Sol system. We called it the Internet, or more informally, the Web. Much like the extranet, we used it for entertainment, shopping, and backing up information from paper books.
She paused to take another drink, seemingly having quickly adapted to the sharper taste and burn of the higher-proof alcohol. For my part, I poured the remainder of my bottle into my glass and continued to drink as I listened to her talk.
Soon after first contact, the Internet was decommissioned and all of its content was transferred to the extranet. Well, almost all of it. When we transferred the Internet to the galactic extranet, we purposefully removed all information on and related to our previous wars from the transfer, and instead transferred them to a special network that could only be accessed by humans. We then replaced that history with an altered one that made no mention of these wars, and then ensured that non-humans could not obtain the special browsers required to access this hidden network, which we unimaginatively refer to as the Darknet. It was a complex task, as you can imagine, but we did it. We did this out of fear that if our newfound alien friends discovered our true nature, so to speak, that it would badly damage relations and perhaps even make it impossible for us to create relations in the first place. Even the average human cannot access the Darknet by themselves. They must request access to a device that can. Their usage is then monitored for any attempts to download or export that information outside of the net. Those with a special need to know, such as ambassadors, very high-ranking politicians, and military officers with a pay grade of 07 or higher, are given free and unrestricted access to the Darknet for various reasons, namely a reminder of how bad things could go if we let them for the former, and possible tactical insights for the latter. There have been breaches over the years. A small handful of especially curious non-humans have managed to hack into the Darknet. However, we take its security extremely seriously, and they've never been able to stay connected for very long, and certainly not enough to download anything useful. That is where those conspiracy theorists got their information. That is what I'm about to give you willingly. I hope you understand how much trust I have with you to do this. If my superiors found out, I could get into a lot of trouble.
Before I could protest her risking herself for me like this, she turned the datapad around and slid it across her desk to me.
This is not a normal datapad. This is my personal PDA. With it, I can access the Darknet, and by extension, the information on humanity's intraspecies wars. I've already pulled up an overview of every major war humanity has fought with itself, since it took to the stars as they are the most relevant. Please take your time, brace yourself, and remember that we have tried very hard to make ourselves better than when these conflicts took place.
Once she had finished, she reached into her desk drawer again and pulled out what I knew to be a pack of cigarettes, before leaning back in her chair and lighting one. I had never known Ali to use them, but I suppose she had always refrained from doing so in my presence, for my health's sake. Doing so now indicated to me just how stressful this was for her. I then turned my attention to the datapad. I almost wanted to say no, to both protect Ali and to preserve my own innocence about humanity's apparent dark nature. My curiosity, however, proved to be stronger. I picked the pad up and began my reading.
Lunar War of 2080 lasted 3 years, 30 million dead. First Mars-Earth War of 2107 lasted 10 years, 250 million dead. Mars-Phobos conflict of 2115 lasted 1 year, 5 million dead. Earth-Europa Cold War lasted 30 years, 10 million dead.
As I read, I both became more frightened and awed. Humanity's capacity for killing was incredible. In just a single conflict that lasted for a single year, they had sustained over 7 times the number of casualties the Jadani did in our own single worldwide war. However, their technological advancement was incredible too. In just 150 years, they went from landing on their planet's moon to being able to densely populate a moon 32 light-minutes away from their homeworld despite this apparent constant mass death. I continued reading, my horror slowly beginning to grow faster than my awe.
Inner Colonies War lasted 15 years, 200 million dead. War of the Five Families lasted 4 years, 360 million dead. Outer Colonies Insurrection lasted 15 years, 500 million dead.
It was clear that the more developed and spread out humanity became, the more violent, destructive, and intermixed their wars became. At the same time, Earth was dealing with a rebellion on Venus. The moon colonies of Uranus and Neptune were blasting each other into ash with nuclear weapons. I had been going in chronological order so far, and it now brought me to the first conflict that really hammered home what Ali had talked about during the speech.
First Great Solar War lasted 4 years.
They slowly transferred to speaking aloud.
5.9 billion dead.
When Ali heard me speak those words, she turned to look me in the eye. I could tell she knew exactly what war I glanced at from just the death toll alone.
You've come to the First Great Solar War, haven't you?
I was stunned and maybe a bit numb. All I could do was nod my head. She exhaled smoke from her nose and took a sip of her drink.
Keep going, it gets worse.
Worse?
I thought.
How could it get worse?
I continued reading.
Pluto-Triton Brush War lasted 17 years, 250 million dead. Second Earth-Mars War lasted 15 years, 800 million dead. Jupiter-Saturn Holy War of 2142 lasted 2 years, 450 million dead.
Then I came to one that almost stopped my heart cold.
The Second Great Solar War lasted 7 years, 13.7 billion dead.
I stopped and scrolled through its section. The pictures and descriptions I read, I will not share them here. Needless to say, I set the datapad down as I could feel the liquor I had consumed begin to make its way back up. Ali noticed and handed me a small waste basket she kept next to her desk. I just got it in front of me as the contents of my stomach returned to being outside of my body. When I was finished, I saw Ali staring solemnly at me.
I told you it got worse.
She said as she downed what was left in her glass. When I regained control of my bodily functions, I turned to speak to her.
Ali, I never could have.
I stopped myself when I saw the look on her face. She finished my thoughts for me.
Never could have imagined we could do such things to each other. I don't blame you.
There was one question on my mind, however.
Ali, how could humanity sustain such losses of life? Tens of billions dead in less than a century.
She surprised me by giving a subdued chuckle.
Let's just say it also took us a while to learn to control our reproductive habits. It also didn't help that around 2070, we learned how to drastically improve our infant survival rate with genetic engineering. We went from 13 deaths for every 1,000 births in 2065 to just 1 per 1,000 in 2085. Add in an overall increased population in general, lots of post-war celebrations, and various wartime dedicated breeding programs, and even despite our mass slaughter, our overall population was still increasing. Imagine that. Making sure more babies survive meant more meat for the grinder.
She sighed loudly, and I could tell what she was about to say.
I'm not going to lie to you, Genta, for as horrible as it seems so far, you haven't reached the apex. If you don't wish to continue, I will not blame you.
I debated with myself if I wanted to continue. My curiosity was subdued, but now I almost felt an obligation to know about humanity's self-inflicted suffering. It took a couple minutes, but I picked the data pad up once again and continued. As I started, however, I noticed that there was a considerable gap between the end of the war I stopped on and the beginning of the next.
Ali, why is there such a long gap between the Second Great Solar War and the Mex conflict?
She contemplated her response for a while before answering.
The butchery of Solar War II finally gave us pause. We had started to see how senseless it all was. We made attempts to implement measures to prevent future wars. We had tried to do so before, but they proved inadequate for the challenges of a humanity spread throughout the Sol system. Without a central authority with the power to make binding law across all the Sol system, however, it wasn't enough. We began to try and work together as a species, but those first steps were baby ones. They didn't go far enough. Keep reading and you'll soon see what finally caused us to become what we are now.
I prepared myself for the worst, or at least I thought I did.
Earth Civil War lasted 4 years, 1.5 billion dead. Mars-Titan skirmish of 2154 lasted 1 year, 700 million dead. Europa-Titan Brush War lasted 6 years, 300 million dead. Mars Civil War lasted 5 years, 1.1 billion dead. The Belt Corporation War lasted 10 years, 1 billion dead. The Final War lasted 32 years.
I stopped reading in my head and just stared at the casualty figure, seeing it but unable to truly process it. I went into a form of shock. My hands became numb. Allie's PDA slipped out of my grasp and clattered to the table. As I started to come to my senses, I heard Ali take a long inhale from her cigarette before exhaling it. I turned to look at her as she crushed the cigarette into an ashtray I hadn't noticed. She knew exactly what I had just read.
The Final War, known at the time as the Third Great Solar War, lasted for 32 years from 2163 to 2195. Casualties, 31.6 billion out of a total population of some 43.3 billion. The true war to end all wars. The time had come when all of humanity would finally have it out, once and for all. Nobody was safe, nothing was off limits. Every major faction and power used every ounce of firepower they had at their disposal. Conventional, nuclear, biological, chemical, all of it.
She picked up her drink and finished it off.
More than half of all inhabited territory in the Sol system was devastated. Those warnings we give out for vessels to avoid Titan, we say it was because of an industrial accident, but in reality, Mars had developed a chemical weapon that could persist in the air with peak lethality forever. When they deployed it, the entire population of Titan, all 3 billion of them, were killed. Nobody could escape. Any vessel that made it off the planet was pounced on and destroyed. We've spent every moment since we recovered from the war trying to clear it. We're hoping a recent development in some research with the Hadar might be finally giving a breakthrough. They don't know exactly. We're planning on using it for, by the way, but we've had false hopes before.
She reached across the table and retrieved her PDA.
Mars underwent a nuclear winter, a previously unproven outcome of a nuclear exchange. Turns out you just needed to detonate thousands of 100-plus megaton nuclear weapons within a couple months. And Earth, oh, Earth.
She turned to look at a picture hanging on the wall. It was a picture of Earth, with the planet fully illuminated. Its name was the Blue Marble. It was my favorite picture of Earth, as well as Ali's.
Our birth world was wrecked. Half her population dead, half of the rest wounded or maimed for life. Entire continents' worth of ecosystems were wiped out when wildfires burned up half of Asia and Europe.
She lit another cigarette.
Did you know that Mars used to have 2 moons? No, of course you don't. The missing one was called Deimos. We've wiped all records of its existence outside of the darknet. That's because the leaders of Mars at the time had created a way to move entire asteroids. Deimos wasn't much bigger than most asteroids, so they launched it at Earth. Thankfully, the use of the first and only gigaton-yield nuclear weapon in human history was enough to essentially neutralize it as a threat.
She took another drag off her cigarette.
It was complete and utter insanity. So many generations just gone. I suppose now is where I tell you how this Armageddon managed to turn us into the peaceful people you know today. That is, if you want me to.
I gave it a few moments of thought, but seeing as the worst seemed to be behind me, I figured I might as well hear about humanity's rebound. I nodded my head in answer to her question. For the first time since I arrived, she gave a genuine smile of happiness.
Well then, that's where Cyrus the Great comes into play. Before the final war, Emperor Cyrus was merely just another politician on Earth, very influential, charismatic, and one of the most intelligent people in the Sol system, but not someone you'd have imagined would one day unite humanity. After surviving the opening strikes against Earth by the Mercury Regency, he ended up being the next in line to lead what was once the Earth Republic. As the war raged on, he became more and more aware that if things kept going the way they were, that humanity was going to wipe itself out. Then, about 20 years after the start of the war, the day came when his entire family was killed in an attack on Luna. This caused him to retreat from public life, and he was only heard from via messages sent from his private estate in the Yukon. He stayed locked away for over 2 years before suddenly returning. He had spent that time formulating a plan to end the war. To implement it, however, he needed the authority and power of being the President of Earth. To that end, he arranged a meeting with the, at the time, current president. It was secret, and no record exists of what went on in his Yukon estate between the two. When it was over, however, the president stepped down and gave Cyrus the position. The future emperor got to work. First, he managed to unite the varying internal factions of Earth, some through diplomatic means, others through more direct measures. Once his base of power was secure, he moved to external threats. He started with the inner planets, Mercury and Venus. Through the power of pen and sword, carrot and stick, he brought both worlds to heel and added their economical, scientific, and military might to his own. I'm paraphrasing a lot, obviously, but to fully explain everything would take quite a while. Anyway, he then managed to negotiate a temporary peace with the moons of Neptune and Uranus. With the threat from them diminished for the time being and the moons of Jupiter and Saturn too busy fighting each other, he withdrew all of his power back to the inner worlds and focused on rebuilding and repairing what damage he could. It was during this time that he broke down the various powers and factions of the inner three worlds and reconstituted them into the United Earth Empire, with himself at the helm. He directly contributed to strategy and research, using his great intelligence to solve problems that had seemingly been unsolvable. While he didn't take credit, evidence points to him being the one to finally solve the great mystery that was warp drive. With its tactical and strategic advantages to the technology then currently used to traverse the solar system, UEE forces could beat any that stood against them. When he was ready, he began the Great Advance.
She paused to grab another couple of ice cubes from her fridge and refill her glass. She also retrieved a second bottle of the Jordanian rum she had originally offered me and handed it to me. I declined it, both because my stomach was still upset from my previous ejection of it from my body, and because I wanted to remain as clear-headed as possible as she revealed the events of the final war to me. She had me intrigued beyond all reason. I could have gotten a more in-depth explanation by reading her PDA, but the way she told the story kept me glued to my seat.
So planet by planet, moon by moon, city by city, his forces took control of the Sol system. Mars was the obvious first target, both because it represented the biggest threat to the Empire and because control of it would unlock the resources of large sections of the asteroid belt so they could fuel the advance. The Mars hegemony rejected all attempts at peace, believing they still had an advantage. They kept up this arrogant attitude, even as their fleets were constantly outflanked, outfought, and destroyed in detail. It wasn't until Imperial forces were at the gates of the planetary capital, Olympus, that they finally admitted defeat. Once dealt with, what remained of the hegemony was integrated into the Empire, which included the dozen or so remaining inhabited asteroids in the belt. Then came Jupiter. Having the most inhabited moons of any planet in the Sol system, the battle for the planet was even longer than the fight for Mars, lasting 5 years. Like Mars, however, they did fall. Once Jupiter was taken, the Imperial fleet moved on to Saturn. Unsurprisingly, the relentless advance of the Empire had shaken faith that anyone else but the UE could win the war. Titan had long since been wiped out, but of the remaining 61 inhabited moons, 40 surrendered without a fight. The remainder joined forces in a last-ditch attempt to resist. To make an example of one of them, the Emperor ordered that one of the uninhabited moons be used as a projectile against Rhea, Saturn's second-largest moon, and the most formidable of the remaining hostile ones. The moon was not destroyed, but all on its surface died either from impact or the after effects. We've since explained this away as a freak accident from experimentation with moving asteroids, something you now know was done 100% on purpose. Once it was seen that they stood no chance, they too surrendered. All that remained was Neptune and Uranus. Pluto's population had either been killed or left to join other colonies. Surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, and clearly overmatched, all 27 inhabited moons raised the white flag on the same day. After 32 unimaginably devastating years, the war was over.
She paused to allow me to process everything. It was unbelievable, yet I knew every word was true.
Ali, this story is incredible. The fact that humanity is still around after such a conflict is amazing.
At my saying this, a solemn smile played on her face as she spoke.
Yes, it is. If it wasn't for Emperor Cyrus, humanity would have wiped itself out. He brought us back from the brink and more. Once the war was over, the Emperor turned his brilliance to rebuilding. As I said, the Sol system was wrecked. His first order of business was to clear up as much of the ecological damage as possible, ending the nuclear winter of Mars, repairing the depletion of Earth's biosphere. It took decades and all the brain power Cyrus and the best remaining scientists at his disposal could muster, but they did it. Some things needed more time to fully play out, such as clearing up radiation from nuclear weapons that weren't as clean as the fusion-powered ones we use today, but they were set well in their way. A few remnants, like Titan, remain, but we've managed to convince everyone that they're natural occurrences or accidents. Next, he took on the challenge of reforming the Empire. During the war, he needed the power of being the only one with real authority. But now that it was over, he knew that such power would be dangerous once he was gone. So he modified the system, made the Empire a democratic government similar to the one he inherited but different enough to be its own government, and ensured that the position of Emperor was a figurehead at most. This new empire is the one you know today, with the exception of the position of Emperor still being actively occupied back then, obviously. He considered stepping down and naming someone who he could trust as his successor, but he remained on the throne by popular demand.
She finished her drink again, but this time she capped the bottle and set her glass aside. She also put out her cigarette.
The final act Cyrus did in his life was to help guide the remainder of humanity on this journey to peaceful existence we've tried to maintain. After 3/4 of our species was killed at our own hand, our bloodlust seemed to have subsided. There was finally a realization that the final war and conflicts before it had accomplished nothing but nearly driving humanity to extinction. Cyrus's great advance showed that humanity was stronger together, and to be together meant we had to stop slaughtering each other. Cyrus helped to shape education, to instill in all of us the importance of cooperation and peace. The one silver lining to the slaughter was that a lot of the more enthusiastic members of humanity that enjoyed and pushed for the violence were dead. A lot of those who were left had gone from birth to adulthood knowing nothing but war. When they saw how much better peace was compared to what they had grown up with, they gladly followed Cyrus's teachings of peace. His preference for peace did not mean he was a pacifist. After all, it had been his brilliant military strategies that had ended the war. In us, he also instilled the importance of preparation. Even in the midst of those centuries of war, we were still studying the stars. As our technology improved, it became clear that by all likelihood, we were not alone in the galaxy. However, it was unknown if these hypothetical aliens would come in peace. There was also the possibility that over time, the lessons of the final war would be forgotten, and that others would try and return us to violence. To that end, we still maintained a sizable military and kept many of our military traditions alive. In essence, he guided humanity to follow the ideal of speak softly and carry a big stick on a species-wide scale.
Allie finally paused and looked at a picture that was hanging on the wall directly opposite the picture of Earth. I knew it to be of Cyrus the Great. He looked like a weathered old human, easily over 110 human years old. Frayed and graying hair. His eyes seemed to be filled with exhaustion, yet also a certain joy or perhaps pride. Allie cleared her throat.
Cyrus the Great saved humanity and turned us into a proudly peaceful yet prepared people. However, the stress of the final war and the decades of rebuilding and reshaping of humanity took its toll on the Emperor. In the last 2 decades of his life, he lost much of the energy of his younger years. Even at 100 years old, he was always on the move, tending to some problem or another, but he was slowly deteriorating. He needed more and more assistance just to get around. His mind wasn't as sharp as it used to be. Eventually, at 125 years old, he simply went to sleep one night and didn't wake up the next morning. He left no heir, nor did he name a successor. All that we have to indicate his final thoughts was a note he left on the nightstand beside his bed. It read, "I've done all I can do. Live long and peacefully so that you all may prosper." We like to imagine that when he was satisfied that humanity was saved and set on the right course, he saw no need to continue struggling to stay alive. His funeral was naturally the biggest in human history. His body made a tour of the Sol system, visiting every inhabited body and drawing massive crowds. Eventually, the tomb of Cyrus was created, and his body entombed there where it rests till this day. We continued on and tried our best to follow his wishes. Even though we now had warp drive, it was not yet fast enough to make traveling the stars a realistic possibility, and even after all that time, we still had more work to do on restoring our solar system to its pre-war state. So we focused on that. After 100 years, we were satisfied enough that home was back to normal and were just beginning to plan an expedition to Alpha Centauri, which was now more than feasible thanks to advancements in warp drive when that Canar freighter ended up in the Sol system. The rest, you know.
I sat in silence, taking in all she had said. I had not come expecting to learn so much, but I was grateful to have done so. So many things now made much more sense. Humanity had always been incredibly skilled at terraforming and adept with repairing environmental damage. This explained that ability. Some things still didn't quite fit together, But it was then that I noticed that over 3 hours had passed. I didn't wish to keep Ali at her office for much longer, so I decided to wrap up our conversation.
Ali, I cannot express how pleased I am that you trusted me enough to show and tell me all this. It is beyond anything I could have possibly imagined. It'll take some time for me to truly process everything you have told me, but I thank you for doing so.
Ali gave me a warm smile as she stood up and stretched.
Happy to have done so. It is quite a relief to finally have told a non-human all of this. We've gone to extraordinary lengths to present an altered history to the wider galaxy, while keeping ourselves educated on what actually happened. Now that we're at war, though, I don't know if we can or should keep the rest of the galaxy in the dark.
I nodded in agreement.
If you want a Jadani's advice, it's best to just get it over with. Keeping things bottled up will only cause problems down the line.
Ellie smiled again as she walked around her desk to place a caring hand on my shoulder and spoke.
Yeah, you're right. Honestly, I've been considering recommending that we do just that. We've had 30 years to make relations. At this point, if people want to be our friends, they'll be that while accepting us for who we are. Now that I've told you, I'm thinking I'll finally get around to doing it.
That got a smile out of me. Regardless of whether the rest of the galaxy deserved to know humanity's true past, I believed that it might even help ease some of the tensions humanity was having with its history.
Well, Ali, it's getting late though, so I say we call it a night. Agreed?
She nodded her head and stood up.
Genta, thanks again for listening to our story. Remember, you are the first non-human to know. I trust you'll keep it quiet until we get around to telling the rest of the galaxy ourselves.
I nodded.
Of course, Ami. I would never endanger you by letting any of what we discussed go beyond this room.
She patted me on the back as we left her office.
Thanks. I knew I could trust you.
It was going to be interesting to see how this war would shape up, now that I better understood humanity's history with warfare. The Hadzai truly had no idea what they had unleashed.